The first signs were subtle. Soldiers who marched longer, fought harder, and slept almost not at all. Officers reported units that seemed unnaturally alert, pushing beyond limits any normal man could endure. At first, it looked like discipline, the kind the German army had been praised for. But behind the sharp eyes and restless energy was something far more engineered. By the early years of the Second World War, methamphetamine tablets were circulating through the ranks like rations. Cheap, portable, and devastatingly effective, they promised stamina in battles where exhaustion meant death. Commanders called it a tactical advantage. Scientists called it progress. Soldiers, however, learned the truth. The drug that kept them awake also hollowed them out from the inside. This is addicted to meth. The shocking truth about Hitler's army. The story of how a stimulant became a hidden weapon of war, reshaping the front lines, the men who fought on them, and the price that followed long after the battles ended. So tonight, lower the lights and listen closely. Imagine the hum of engines, the trembling hands of sleepless soldiers, and the marching columns powered by a drug they barely understood. Subscribe and stay with me. Tell me where you're watching from, and remember the men who fought under artificial strength, driven past their limits by a war that demanded more than any human body could give. The story begins long before the first shot of the Second World War, in a Germany defined by laboratories as much as politics. By the early 1930s, the nation was still marked by the scars of its defeat in the Great War, industrial shortages, fractured pride, and an economy that strained under international pressure. Yet amid these hardships, one sector not only survived but thrived: pharmaceuticals. German chemists had been shaping the modern medical world since the late 19th century, and by the time Hitler rose to power, the country remained the global center for chemical innovation. Factories produced dyes, anesthetics, painkillers, and stimulants with the same precision found in steel and armaments. Inside these laboratories, the pursuit of chemical solutions to human problems became a quiet war of its own. Researchers were driven not only by scientific curiosity, but by a nationalistic desire to restore German prestige through chemistry. That determination took many forms, from the development of synthetic fuels to medications capable of sustaining exhausted workers. Among these experiments, stimulant research stood out. Scientists believed fatigue could be conquered by chemistry, that a simple pill might unlock unprecedented productivity at a time when every hour of labor mattered. Doctors, too, were swept up in the optimism. In bustling cities like Berlin and Munich, physicians prescribed early amphetamine-based compounds to treat lethargy, depression, and even obesity. These drugs promised alertness, improved mood, and sharper concentration. The workforce, pressured by economic demands and long workdays, embraced them. For many Germans, stimulants became an unremarkable part of daily life, a quiet adaptation to the relentless pace of recovery. No one yet questioned what happened when the body pushed far beyond its natural limits. This pharmaceutical landscape formed the backdrop for the rise of the Nazi state. When Hitler consolidated control in 1933, he inherited a nation whose scientific community was already producing chemicals that improved stamina and dulled pain. What he saw in these compounds was opportunity. A military, aspiring to expand rapidly, while constrained by Treaty of Versailles limitations, needed every advantage it could get. If German soldiers could stay awake longer, march farther, or fight harder than their opponents did, the imbalance could tilt in Germany's favor even before its factories reached full wartime capacity. The link between medicine and militarization tightened quickly. Research funding increased. Laboratories aligned their priorities with national goals. The boundary between civilian drug use and military application grew thinner each year. When new stimulants, including methamphetamine, began to show extraordinary results in clinical trials, military physicians took notice. The idea that chemistry could reshape human endurance moved from speculation to strategy. By the late 1930s, Germany was no longer simply developing medicine, it was preparing tools. Stimulants, once seen as treatments, were reimagined as instruments of efficiency and eventually as instruments of war. The pharmaceutical successes that had once symbolized German resilience were quietly repurposed to support a military machine preparing for expansion. In these early years, no one could fully foresee the consequences. To many scientists, the work felt like progress. To government officials, it looked like strength. But for the soldiers who would soon swallow the tablets handed out like rations, this landscape of innovation marked the beginning of a path that would push them past exhaustion, past reason, and sometimes past humanity itself. The drug that would fuel the Wehrmacht's lightning victories was already being born not on the battlefield, but in sterile rooms filled with glassware, ambition, and the belief that chemistry could triumph over human limitation. The turning point came in a laboratory belonging to WWII, a mid-sized pharmaceutical company in Berlin. It was here, in the late 1930s, that chemist Fritz Hauschild synthesized a compound that would soon ripple through every corner of German society: methamphetamine hydrochloride. On paper, it was a simple stimulant, a chemical cousin of amphetamine, already known for sharpening focus and suppressing fatigue. But in practice, this new substance carried a potency that exceeded anything doctors had worked with before. Hauschild and his colleagues approached the discovery with clinical optimism. They believed they had created a medication capable of lifting mood, increasing alertness, and restoring productivity in a population still recovering from economic despair. Berlin, the beating industrial heart of the nation, was a city that demanded long hours and unwavering efficiency. A pill that could keep pace with those demands seemed almost like a public good. When Pervitin, packaged in small white boxes with clean, reassuring typography, first entered pharmacies, it did so as a symbol of modern medical progress. The early advertising cemented this image. Posters showed smiling office workers, energetic mothers, and students studying late into the night. Pervitin was presented as a remedy for exhaustion, a way to restart the engine of daily life. Magazines described it as harmless, reliable, and safe enough for routine use. It appeared in chocolates, in tablets, even in small ampules. The message was clear. This was not a dangerous drug. This was the future. Doctors embraced it quickly. General practitioners wrote prescriptions for workers grinding through double shifts, for housewives who felt overwhelmed, for students preparing for exams. The testimonials amazed them. Patients reported newfound stamina, brighter moods, and an almost mechanical clarity of thought. Some remarked they no longer needed sleep. Others found themselves working longer hours without complaint. In households across Germany, Pervitin became as common as aspirin. Yet, behind the enthusiasm, subtle warnings began to emerge. A few physicians noticed patients returning with hollow eyes, trembling hands, or sudden crashes after days of apparently superhuman productivity. Some spoke quietly of agitation, paranoia, or emotional instability. But in a nation where efficiency had become a moral virtue and where political pressure discouraged dissent, these concerns faded beneath the drug's rapid success. Meanwhile, government officials observed this transformation with interest. Reports circulated through civilian medical channels documenting the profound effect Pervitin had on fatigue and endurance. In a country preparing for expansion, the military understood the value of any compound capable of extending human performance. Internal discussions began. Could a stimulant designed for office workers become an asset for soldiers? WWII, eager for state endorsement, promoted Pervitin as a potential tool for the military. They sent samples to army medical offices, highlighting the drug's ability to keep users awake for days. Wehrmacht physicians conducted small, discrete trials, monitoring reaction times, stamina, and morale. The results exceeded expectations. Troops on Pervitin marched farther, for longer, and with fewer complaints than their untreated peers. For the first time, the military began to envision a chemically enhanced fighting force. What began as a pharmaceutical advancement for ordinary citizens was quietly shifting into something else: a future in which human endurance could be engineered, regulated, and deployed like ammunition. Pervitin had crossed a threshold. It was no longer simply a pill. It was a resource. In the years to come, this unassuming white tablet would accompany soldiers into tanks, trenches, cockpits, and frozen forests. But its origins, rooted in the optimism of civilian medicine, reveal the unsettling truth at the heart of the story. The line between scientific progress and military exploitation was far thinner than anyone realized. The drug that would help drive Germany's early lightning victories had begun its journey not on the battlefield, but at a pharmacy counter disguised as help, wrapped in the language of modern life, waiting to be repurposed into something far more dangerous. Before the German military ever considered methamphetamine a strategic asset, it gained its earliest and most enthusiastic supporters in the country's civilian medical community. Throughout the mid-1930s, German doctors faced a population still weighed down by exhaustion, malnutrition, and the psychological aftershocks of a collapsed economy. Their patients were factory workers pushing through long shifts, mothers struggling to manage households on limited means, and students overwhelmed by the demands of a rapidly modernizing society. Fatigue, physical and emotional, was everywhere. Into this landscape stepped Pervitin, a small tablet promising clarity, stamina, and relief. To many physicians, it seemed like exactly what the public needed. It was modern, scientifically produced, and marketed with a confidence that matched the era's fascination with efficiency. Packaged in neat boxes and supported by optimistic literature, the drug presented itself as a solution to problems that felt too large for traditional medicine. Doctors began prescribing it with little hesitation. Patients described miraculous improvements, the ability to work without breaks, concentrate for hours, and push away feelings of despair that had lingered since the Depression years. Some felt they had rediscovered a part of themselves, a sharpness, a motivation, a resilience they believed had been lost. For physicians, these results were difficult to ignore. The drug did not simply mask symptoms. It appeared to transform the patient's capacity for life. Medical journals published early case studies praising Pervitin's benefits. Practitioners wrote about increased productivity, improved mood, and reduced reliance on rest. The drug's side effects, elevated heart rate, jitteriness, and occasional insomnia, were noted but rarely emphasized. In a nation rebuilding itself under the pressures of political transformation, progress mattered more than caution. Housewives, burdened by domestic expectations and social pressures, became some of the most frequent users. They reported newfound energy, the ability to complete chores far more quickly, and a sense of emotional steadiness that made long days bearable. Students used it to study late into the night. Laborers relied on it to endure physically demanding tasks. Even hospital staff, nurses, orderlies, and medical assistants quietly took the pills to keep pace with the growing demands of their shifts. A cultural shift took place. Pervitin was not seen as a drug but as an enhancer of everyday life. Its use became normalized, even encouraged. Newspapers published stories about the new pill for tiredness, while advertisements suggested it helped people live with precision. Germany, a nation obsessed with order and productivity, had found a chemical embodiment of its ideals. But beneath the enthusiasm, unease quietly grew. Physicians noticed patients returning more frequently, asking for larger prescriptions, or reporting that the tablets had lost their earlier effectiveness. Some individuals began experiencing severe crashes, overwhelming fatigue, irritability, or sudden emotional withdrawal. Others showed signs of dependency, unable to maintain their routines without the drug's harsh clarity. A few doctors attempted to raise concerns. They reported cases of anxiety, rapid weight loss, and erratic behavior. But their warnings were overshadowed by the drug's popularity and the political climate that praised efficiency above all else. In a society preparing itself consciously or not for war, the idea of a population made more resilient through chemistry fit comfortably into the national narrative. By the time military authorities took notice, the civilian world had already proven Pervitin's power and its risks. Doctors, through ordinary prescriptions and well-meaning optimism, had inadvertently laid the foundation for something far larger. What they considered a medical breakthrough would soon be repurposed on a scale no one in their clinics could have imagined. The miracle pill was about to leave the examination room and enter the battlefield, and the consequences would extend far beyond the early optimism of the doctors who first believed in it. The turning point came quietly. Long before Pervitin became standard issue for soldiers, a handful of military physicians began to notice something unusual in the civilians entering their ranks. New recruits arrived sharper, more alert, and able to push through the grueling demands of basic training with almost unnatural stamina. They were energetic, restless, and often capable of marching or drilling with a level of intensity that caught instructors off guard. At first, it seemed like a generational shift. Young men, hardened by economic hardship and eager for a place in Hitler's expanding military machine. But patterns emerged. Recruits from industrial centers displayed these traits most strongly. Some openly admitted to using the little white pills to study, work night shifts, or stay awake through long days. Others didn't admit it at all. The signs were simply obvious: elevated heart rates, bright eyes, and an ability to suppress fatigue far longer than normal. Military doctors began to suspect that something more than discipline was at work. Reports trickled upward. Not official ones, not yet, but conversations, notes, and observations shared among officers who oversaw training. They described young men who could drill for hours without rest, push past exhaustion without complaint, and seem almost immune to the mental fog that typically accompanied prolonged exertion. Instructors noted that while these recruits performed impressively at first, they sometimes crashed in dramatic fashion. Sudden fatigue, irritability, or lapses in coordination. It was inconsistent, but impossible to ignore. By this time, the Wehrmacht's medical branch had already been approached by WWII, the manufacturer of Pervitin. The company, aware that military approval would be a major breakthrough, emphasized the drug's benefits: heightened focus, reduced fear, prolonged endurance. The message resonated. Germany's military was rebuilding under strict time pressure, determined to expand rapidly while evading the constraints of the Versailles Treaty. Anything that boosted performance, even temporarily, was seen as valuable. Military physicians conducted discreet evaluations. They distributed small amounts of Pervitin to selected personnel under controlled conditions, measuring reaction times, stamina, and wakefulness. The results were immediate and dramatic. Soldiers on Pervitin marched for extended periods with minimal rest, completed tasks with heightened speed, and reacted faster during drills. Officers overseeing these tests wrote blunt, clinical summaries: increased alertness, reduced need for sleep, heightened focus during night operations. For a military thinking increasingly in terms of mobility, speed, and surprise, the implications were hard to ignore. Blitzkrieg, a doctrine still evolving, depended on rapid advances, long marches, and relentless pressure on the enemy. If chemistry could help soldiers maintain such momentum, it was a tool worth considering. Still, there were hesitations. Some medical officers worried about dependency and psychological instability. They questioned whether the crashes that followed extended use could compromise entire units at critical moments. Others pointed out that Pervitin's effect seemed strongest in the short term but unpredictable over long campaigns. Yet these warnings were subdued, overshadowed by the drug's undeniable utility in trial scenarios. By the late 1930s, the military was paying close attention. Discussions about stimulant use shifted from speculation to strategy. Commanders saw in Pervitin a way to amplify the human component of their war machine. If troops could stay awake through nights that their enemies spent resting, if fatigue could be chemically postponed, then operations could be executed at a pace no opposing force could match. Germany's leadership, already embracing science as a pillar of national strength, saw the drug as part of a broader vision: a modern, efficient, chemically supported army. The ethical considerations faded behind logistical imperatives. Human limits, once a constraint, were being reconsidered as obstacles to be engineered away. The early observations of unusually alert recruits had opened a door. What stepped through was not just a pill, but a new way of thinking about soldiers, not as men bound by natural endurance, but as instruments whose performance could be enhanced, stretched, and exploited. The army had taken notice. What came next would transform warfare. The Wehrmacht's first official experiments with Pervitin began without ceremony and with minimal documentation, a quiet initiative carried out in barracks, medical stations, and training grounds scattered across Germany. These were not publicized trials with rigorous oversight. They were practical tests, shaped by military pragmatism and driven by a simple question: could a chemical stimulant extend the effectiveness of German soldiers in wartime conditions? Military physicians selected small groups of volunteers, often young recruits eager to impress or seasoned NCOs curious about the new wakefulness pill being whispered about across the ranks. The instructions were straightforward: take the tablets, perform the drills, and report any physical or mental changes. The soldiers complied, unaware that their participation marked the beginning of one of the most widespread pharmacological experiments in modern warfare. The first results were recorded in controlled marches. Normally, a forced march lasting 20 to 30 kilometers left even well-trained soldiers fatigued, their movements slowing, their attention drifting. But with Pervitin, the difference was immediate. The pace increased. Rest breaks shrank. Soldiers remained upright and alert long after their bodies should have demanded relief. Officers observing the tests reported unusual stamina, heightened alertness, and reduced complaints of pain and exhaustion. Some soldiers described a sense of invincibility, as if their minds had detached from the forced limits of their bodies. Night operations were the next focus. Traditionally, fatigue made night exercises taxing, with reaction times dropping and coordination faltering. But on Pervitin, recruits stayed sharp. They responded quickly to commands, navigated obstacles with precision, and executed maneuvers long past midnight, without showing typical signs of strain. One report noted that participants maintained clarity of thought even after 24 hours of continuous activity. It was the kind of performance officers had long desired, but rarely seen. Yet there were warning signs. Soldiers pushed too far, not because they were forced to, but because the drug made them feel capable of more than their bodies could realistically endure. Some collapsed suddenly, their knees buckling without warning. Others became irritable or restless during rest periods, pacing instead of sleeping. A few experienced tremors or reported a sense of overwhelming anxiety once the stimulant wore off. Medical officers documented these symptoms, but the entries were brief, overshadowed by the overwhelmingly positive performance data. The most concerning observations came from psychological assessments. Soldiers who had taken higher doses during prolonged exercises reported hearing indistinct whispers, seeing movement in the dark that wasn't there, or feeling watched even in empty spaces. These hallucinations were subtle, often dismissed as exhaustion-induced. But a handful of doctors expressed early concern that the drug might distort perception under stress, a dangerous prospect in the chaos of combat. Still, the momentum was impossible to slow. Commanders reviewing the findings saw promise, not danger. Germany was modernizing its military doctrine, transitioning from the static warfare of the Great War to a strategy built on rapid movement, coordinated strikes, and overwhelming surprise. Pervitin seemed perfectly suited to this vision. A stimulant that kept soldiers awake during forced marches, alert during night maneuvers, and aggressive during contact with the enemy, offered tactical advantages no traditional training could match. By the end of the trials, internal reports circulated through military channels recommending wider distribution. The drug was labeled operationally useful and suitable for deployment under combat conditions. Ethical considerations were minimal. The strategic value overshadowed everything else. The Wehrmacht concluded that methamphetamine was not merely a supplement, it was a force multiplier. The soldiers who participated in these trials could not have known that their experiences would soon be replicated on a massive scale, across entire divisions and theatres of war. What began as small, controlled experiments would soon shape the tempo of the earliest campaigns of World War II. The German army had tested the limits of its men and now believed it had found a way to push them further than ever before. As the 1930s closed and the storm of war approached, Germany's military leadership began to view chemistry not as a supplement to strategy, but as an integral part of it. The lessons drawn from early Pervitin trials convinced planners that human endurance could be engineered just as decisively as tanks, aircraft, or munitions. This shift in thinking was subtle, at first a line in a report, a recommendation in a medical briefing, but it grew rapidly into a doctrine that fused pharmacology with military ambition. The Nazi regime had always embraced scientific advancement as a symbol of national strength. From synthetic fuel production to chemical warfare research, every laboratory discovery was evaluated through a strategic lens. Pervitin entered this environment as more than a stimulant. It was a potential tool for shaping the performance of an army preparing for a new kind of conflict. Blitzkrieg depended on relentless pressure, rapid movement, and synchronized surprise, a tempo that demanded soldiers capable of fighting continuously without the predictable cycles of sleep and fatigue. High-ranking officers, studying the reports submitted by medical units, noted how chemically supported troops could maintain operational readiness long after conventional troops would have faltered. The possibilities were compelling. Entire divisions could march through the night to outflank enemy positions. Tank crews could drive for hours beyond exhaustion, maintaining coordination under conditions that previously guaranteed failure. Infantry could execute forced marches that collapsed the space between planning and action. Chemistry, in essence, offered the potential to compress time, a decisive advantage in any campaign. Meetings held within the Wehrmacht's medical department grew increasingly focused on scaling stimulant use. The question shifted from "should we?" to "how do we operationalize this safely?" Yet the word "safely" became more of a formality than a priority. Discussions centered on dosage schedules, distribution logistics, and integrating Pervitin into supply chains alongside food, ammunition, and first aid equipment. The drug was grouped not with medication, but with operational necessities. Civilian scientists were consulted, though selectively. Temla Werke, sensing enormous opportunity, produced detailed brochures explaining dosage, expected effects, and testimonies from civilian users. They emphasized the pill's reliability, glossed over long-term risks, and framed Pervitin as a scientifically proven method of enhancing human capability. Their messaging aligned with the regime's growing belief that the future of warfare lay not just in steel and firepower, but in biology, in the optimization of the soldier himself. This vision resonated strongly with the architects of Blitzkrieg. War, as they imagined it, would be an unbroken sequence of rapid actions. Rest would be a luxury, delays a liability. If chemistry allowed German forces to act decisively during hours when the enemy rested, then stimulant-aided soldiers could achieve breakthroughs impossible under normal human limitations. It was a simple equation. Longer wakefulness meant longer operational windows. Longer operational windows meant surprise, speed, and shock. Yet, while strategic thinking embraced Pervitin, some military physicians remained uneasy. Internal memoranda hinted at concerns over psychological instability, cardiovascular strain, and dependency. They warned that overstimulation could impair judgment, increase impulsivity, or lead to catastrophic errors under fire. But in an environment dominated by urgency, ambition, and ideological confidence, these warnings were treated as secondary. The war machine demanded results, not caution. By the time the first campaigns were being planned, Pervitin had already become embedded in the logistical structure of the Wehrmacht. It was stocked in medical kits, issued in bulk to operational units, and incorporated into official recommendations for long-duration missions. Officers were instructed on how and when to administer it. Medics were told to monitor troops, but were given little authority to halt distribution. Germany had entered an era where human biology was treated as malleable, a resource to be optimized for the battlefield. The convergence of chemistry and military doctrine was complete. As war loomed over Europe, the German army prepared to unleash not just tanks and aircraft, but soldiers whose endurance was chemically extended beyond natural limits. The consequences, both immediate and long-term, would reshape the very nature of warfare. By the time Germany stood on the edge of war, Pervitin had already moved far beyond laboratory shelves and civilian pharmacies. The Wehrmacht's growing interest transformed the drug from a medical novelty into a strategic commodity. In boardrooms and factory floors across the country, a quiet mobilization began, one that did not involve tanks or artillery, but glass beakers, chemical vats, and assembly lines calibrated to produce millions of stimulant tablets at unprecedented speed. WWII became the epicenter of this effort. Located in Berlin, the company was modest in size compared to Germany's industrial giants, but its product had captured the attention of the nation's military planners. Under pressure from both government interest and skyrocketing civilian demand, the company expanded production rapidly. New equipment was installed, shifts were extended. Workers, many of them unaware of the drug's growing military application, processed raw chemicals late into the night, measuring, mixing, compressing, and packaging non-stop. Government officials arrived at the factory more frequently as 1939 approached. They requested production reports, inspected facilities, and quietly emphasized the need for output increases. WWII executives understood the message. Pervitin was no longer just a consumer product. It was becoming an asset of national importance. Contracts were signed that guaranteed bulk purchases by the Wehrmacht. Special allocations of raw materials were arranged to ensure uninterrupted production. Germany, preparing for conflict, could not afford delays. Inside the factory, the scale of manufacturing grew staggering. Lines of workers oversaw machines that pressed tablets by the thousands. Packaging units filled boxes labeled not for pharmacies, but for military distribution centers. Pallets were stacked with sealed cartons, each containing hundreds of doses destined for barracks, field hospitals, and operational units. Logistics officers coordinated shipments with the same precision used for ammunition or rations. The state's involvement deepened. The Ministry of Armaments monitored stimulant output the way it tracked fuel reserves or steel production. Internal memos described Pervitin as an essential support material, placing it alongside items considered vital for large-scale operations. Chemists were encouraged to refine the formula, ensuring consistency and stability under field conditions. The drug needed to withstand heat, cold, moisture, and transport across vast distances. Civilian access, meanwhile, subtly shifted. Pervitin remained officially available in pharmacies, but supplies tightened as military orders consumed most of the production. The public noticed shortages. Doctors complained of delayed shipments. But explanations were vague, framed as logistical slowdowns rather than deliberate redirection. Few citizens questioned the changes. The atmosphere of growing nationalism redirected scrutiny toward the looming war. Inside the Wehrmacht's supply chain, Pervitin was integrated seamlessly. Quartermasters added it to inventories. Medical officers received guidelines on dosage and distribution. Some units began stockpiling tablets even before orders were formalized, anticipating the long marches and sleepless nights that early campaigns would require. In planning rooms, commanders quietly discussed stimulant-supported operations, imagining offensives executed at a speed no enemy could match. And behind it all, the factory lights at WWII burned through the night. Workers operated the machines in continuous shifts, their faces lit by the glow of furnaces and the flicker of overhead lamps. Trucks arrived at loading docks, with crates marked for military destinations. Documents were stamped, inventories logged, and shipments dispatched to depots scattered across Germany and occupied territories. Pervitin was no longer a pill. It had become a logistical component of warfare, something to be produced, stored, transported, and issued with the same precision as bullets or boots. When German forces would soon surge across borders with a pace that stunned the world, Few outside the military understood that behind the rapid advance lay not only careful planning and mechanized power, but millions of tiny tablets manufactured in quiet workshops. Germany's war machine was being prepared on chemical as well as mechanical foundations. Mass production was complete. The drug that would help accelerate Blitzkrieg was ready to move from assembly lines to the front lines. In the months leading up to the invasion of Poland, a quiet ethical line was crossed inside the German military, a line that few acknowledged and even fewer resisted. Pervitin, by then mass-produced and already circulating widely among civilians, was poised to enter the Wehrmacht's bloodstream on a scale unprecedented in modern warfare. Yet, unlike decisions involving new weapons, tactics, or command structures, the adoption of methamphetamine was not debated, scrutinized, or reviewed. It simply happened. A stimulant became policy, not by decree, but by inertia, carried forward by ambition, necessity, and silence. Within the military's medical hierarchy, concerns were raised, but never loudly. A handful of physicians noted the psychological effects observed during early trials: bursts of restlessness, emotional instability, tremors, and the sudden collapse that often followed extended periods of forced wakefulness. Others worried about the potential for dependency, especially among younger soldiers who had never experienced true combat stress. But these voices found no audience. Germany was preparing for a war of speed, and speed demanded solutions. Anything that offered an advantage was accepted. Anything that warned of long-term risk was set aside. Ethics, in such a climate, became an inconvenience, a luxury reserved for peaceful times. Part of this silence stemmed from the cultural spirit of the era. Germany, in the late 1930s, was a nation intoxicated by ideas of efficiency, discipline, and sacrifice. The state preached that personal limits were obstacles to be overcome through willpower, ideology, and collective purpose. Fatigue was treated less as a physiological reality and more as a sign of weakness. In such an environment, a pill that erased exhaustion was not suspicious. It was patriotic. Military officials reinforced this mindset. Internal discussions framed Pervitin not as a drug, but as a tool, a means of unlocking the true potential of the German soldier. Training literature spoke of enhanced alertness and improved endurance, avoiding any suggestion that soldiers were being chemically pushed beyond natural human boundaries. Commanders, eager to mold an army capable of executing Blitzkrieg with the precision demanded by doctrine, embraced the drug's benefits without asking questions that might complicate the plan. The few who did question the wisdom of widespread stimulant use found themselves isolated. One doctor from a garrison near Hanover submitted a memorandum expressing concern that methamphetamine might impair judgment during extended operations. The document was acknowledged and filed and never mentioned again. Another physician warned that repeated doses could produce aggression, confusion, or paranoia in high-stress environments. His recommendations were watered down until they resembled routine medical advice rather than a warning. The most telling evidence of this ethical vacuum was the absence of informed consent. Soldiers were rarely told what, exactly, they were taking. Tablets were distributed during marches, stuffed into ration kits, or handed out during briefings before major operations. Many soldiers believed the pills were simply vitamins, or stimulants for the road, as some officers casually described them. The military treated its personnel as instruments valuable, yes, but ultimately expendable if it meant achieving strategic objectives. Even outside the military, ethical scrutiny was almost non-existent. Civilian society, accustomed to stimulants marketed as harmless aids for work and study, viewed Pervitin as just another product of modern German ingenuity. Newspapers that praised the nation's scientific achievements did not question the drug's darker implications. Scientists, focused on innovation, rarely considered how their discoveries might be used or misused by the state. In this environment of confidence, nationalism, and blind faith in progress, a crucial truth went unspoken. No one asked whether it was right to chemically enhance soldiers for war. No one considered the psychological toll, the long-term physical damage, or the moral burden placed on men whose minds were being sharpened and strained by a powerful stimulant. Ethics did not fail because they were debated and dismissed. They failed because they were never raised loudly enough to matter, drowned out by the roar of an army preparing to move faster than any in history. The consequences would not take long to reveal themselves. By the time the Wehrmacht prepared for its first major campaigns, Pervitin had completed a transformation that few outside military circles fully understood. What began as a civilian medication, a remedy for exhaustion, a pick-me-up for housewives and laborers, was now treated as an operational asset, packed and distributed alongside ammunition, rations, and medical supplies. The drug's reclassification happened quietly, without formal declaration, but its effects on military planning were unmistakable. Pervitin had become a munition, a small white tablet intended to sharpen soldiers as surely as oil sharpened engines. The shift began in logistics offices, where supply officers were instructed to treat stimulant tablets as consumables essential for long-duration operations. Crates of Pervitin were stacked in depots next to bandages and morphine, waiting to be loaded onto trucks bound for frontline units. The Army Medical Service created standardized allotments for divisions, ensuring that every company received a baseline quantity of stimulants before deploying. In effect, commanders were given chemical tools that could be activated whenever endurance faltered or operational tempo demanded continuous action. For soldiers, the experience was subtle at first. Tablets appeared in ration kits, tucked between canned meat and hard biscuits. Field medics distributed them during forced marches or nighttime maneuvers. Officers, following internal guidelines, would hand out pills before long-distance advances, telling their men that the tablets would help maintain readiness. The language was deliberately vague enough to encourage compliance without prompting questions. Most soldiers accepted the pills without hesitation. In an army built on obedience and discipline, refusal was rare. To military planners, the drug offered something unprecedented: the ability to manipulate time. Sleep, one of the few uncontrollable variables in warfare, could be postponed. Rest could be compressed. Fatigue, the invisible force that slowed armies and weakened resolve, could be silenced for a night, a day, sometimes longer. Pervitin allowed operations to continue when logic dictated pause. A division that might normally require 8 hours of sleep after a full day of marching could now continue advancing through the night, closing distance that Allied units assumed safe. This chemical elasticity of time became an unspoken pillar of German strategy. Blitzkrieg depended on relentless movement, rapid exploitation, and psychological shock. Human endurance, once a limitation, became another component to be managed. Officers learned when to administer stimulants for maximum tactical effect before a breakthrough attempt, during a night assault, or while holding a defensive position under exhaustion. The drug became part of operational planning, a factor considered with fuel, munitions, and terrain. But as Pervitin embedded itself into the mechanics of warfare, troubling signs emerged. Soldiers who took the pills regularly began reporting intense irritability, jitters, and difficulty sleeping, even when rest was allowed. Others described their thoughts racing uncontrollably, or their hearts hammering in their chests during moments of stillness. Some units experienced synchronization issues, men overstimulated and unable to pace themselves, burning through their stamina early in prolonged operations. Officers noticed behavioral changes too. Troops under the influence of Pervitin sometimes acted impulsively, rushing into danger with an aggression that defied training. Others became withdrawn, their focus narrowing to tunnel vision. These reactions were rarely reported formally. Instead, they were noted quietly, dismissed as stress or inexperience, and swallowed by the momentum of unfolding campaigns. Still, within command echelons, the overall assessment remained positive. The perceived advantages, speed, endurance, clarity, overshadowed the emerging downsides. When planning the invasions of Poland, Denmark, Norway, France, and the Low Countries, some senior officers internally credited stimulants for enabling rapid maneuvers impossible under ordinary human limits. The drug became a silent partner in strategic execution, unnamed but essential. In this period, the transformation was complete. Pervitin was no longer a remedy for tiredness. It was a weapon of endurance, a munition shaped not from steel but from chemistry, designed to keep soldiers awake, alert, and moving long after their bodies should have succumbed to exhaustion. Germany's war machine had discovered how to turn medicine into momentum, and soon, as the first campaigns began, the world would witness the consequences of treating human beings as engines fueled not only by rations and orders, but by methamphetamine. By the eve of the invasion of Poland, an unspoken truth had already begun to take shape within the German military. The more the army used Pervitin, the more it needed it. What began as an occasional aid for forced marches and night operations had evolved into a routine component of military life. Tablets, intended for exceptional circumstances, became a quiet expectation. Commanders issued them readily, soldiers accepted them without hesitation, and the machine of war adjusted itself chemically to a new rhythm. Dependency did not arrive all at once. It emerged gradually, woven into the daily demands placed upon soldiers preparing for the fast-paced campaigns of Blitzkrieg. Troops drilled for long hours, performed extended maneuvers, and marched until nightfall, often with little rest between exercises. When exhaustion set in, the pills offered not just relief, but restoration. Men who had grown accustomed to the harsh tempo of training found that Pervitin allowed them to meet those demands without faltering. The drug did not merely help them perform, it helped them conform. Officers encouraged this shift without fully realizing they were fostering chemical reliance. In briefings, they emphasized the need for alertness. During maneuvers, they urged their troops to maintain pace. When fatigue threatened cohesion, tablets were distributed as efficiently as bread or water. Soldiers soon learned that Pervitin was the difference between keeping up and falling behind, between appearing strong in the eyes of their superiors and appearing weak. In barracks and bunks, subtle conversations began. Men whispered about the clarity the pills gave them, the rush of energy, the wakefulness that stretched into early morning. They compared doses, shared strategies for staying sharp, and quietly requested extra tablets from medics who were often willing or pressured to provide them. Some soldiers carried the pills like pocket charms, taking them not only during operations but during training, guard duty, and even moments of personal strain. The drug's psychological pull grew faster than anyone predicted. Pervitin created a sense of heightened capability, a feeling that one could push harder, march farther, react quicker. It became a chemical reinforcement of the ideological demands placed upon every German soldier: strength, discipline, endurance. Taking the pill felt like fulfilling a duty. Not taking it felt like falling behind. Yet the cracks were visible. Soldiers who relied on Pervitin during demanding days found themselves crashing into profound exhaustion once the effects wore off. Some complained of crushing headaches, trembling hands, or sudden irritability. Others struggled to sleep even when allowed rest, their minds racing long after their bodies begged for stillness. A few began taking additional tablets without instruction, attempting to stave off the crash before it arrived, deepening the cycle of dependency with each dose. Medical officers noticed these patterns, but rarely intervened. Reports of erratic behavior, agitation, or sudden fatigue circulated quietly within the medical corps, but the urgency of impending campaigns overshadowed any attempt at systematic regulation. Commanders focused on results, not symptoms. If the pills kept their men moving, the side effects were treated as acceptable costs. The dependency took on a structural form as well. Units scheduled operations with the assumption that soldiers would maintain chemically enhanced alertness. Night marches, extended reconnaissance missions, and back-to-back maneuvers became routine. Rest cycles were shortened. Planning documents referenced stamina and speed in ways that only made sense if stimulants were already assumed. The military machine had begun to depend on a drug, just as its soldiers did. By late summer of 1939, stimulant use was not merely an operational tool, it was a quiet foundation of the Wehrmacht's tempo. soldiers prepared for war with Pervitin in their kits. Officers planned campaigns knowing their troops could stay awake for days. The army had crossed into a realm where human performance was no longer limited by biology alone, but by access to a small tablet that promised endurance at the cost of unknown consequences. What no one fully recognized was that dependency, once established, would be difficult to unwind. The drug that granted the Wehrmacht its early edge would eventually burden it with exhaustion, instability, and psychological strain. But in these early months, as Germany prepared to unleash Blitzkrieg, the price of that dependency remained hidden, overshadowed by the promise of lightning-fast victories fueled by chemical stamina. The war was about to begin, and the army was already addicted to the speed it believed it could control. When German forces crossed into Poland on the first day of September 1939, the world saw tanks, aircraft, and mechanized infantry moving with a pace and coordination that stunned observers. What the world did not see, and what most German soldiers themselves barely understood, was the invisible fuel coursing through thousands of bodies. Pervitin had quietly entered the bloodstream of the Wehrmacht's first major campaign, altering the tempo of war from the very moment the assault began. The invasion was designed to be fast, overwhelming, and psychologically crushing. The High Command demanded movement through the Polish countryside at speeds that would prevent defensive lines from forming. Columns of infantry were expected to follow armored spearheads without pause, maintaining pressure day and night. This relentless schedule would have been nearly impossible under normal human limits. But with stimulant tablets packed into rations and distributed at key logistical points, the Wehrmacht's infantry advanced with a wakefulness that defied exhaustion. Marches that should have required rest became continuous. Soldiers pushed across fields and farm roads for hours beyond their usual limits, maintaining formation despite long periods without sleep. Many described an uncanny clarity during the early days of the campaign, a sharpness that made the landscape feel brighter, their thoughts quicker, their bodies strangely cooperative. For young soldiers experiencing their first real battle, Pervitin delivered a sense of invulnerability that blended seamlessly with adrenaline and training. Tank crews felt the effects even more intensely. Operating inside metal compartments for extended periods required stamina that borders on the unnatural. With the stimulant, crews communicated efficiently, maneuvered quickly, and reacted with near-mechanical precision. One after-action report noted that some panzer crews had remained awake for almost 3 days while pushing deep into Polish territory. Officers praised their iron discipline, unaware that chemistry played just as significant a role as training. Night operations, once considered risky and often avoided, became a defining feature of the campaign. Infantry units marched through darkness without hesitation, guided only by the faint glimmer of moonlight or the outline of vehicles ahead. Polish defenders, expecting German forces to rest after long daytime assaults, found themselves confronted by enemy troops advancing at all hours. This created a psychological shock. Positions believed safe for the night were overrun with startling speed. Yet beneath this momentum, signs of strain were visible to anyone who looked closely. Soldiers reported dry mouths, rapid heartbeats, and shivering hands. Some became irritable or overly talkative. Others marched with a rigid focus that bordered on detachment, responding slowly to anything not directly related to movement or task. A number collapsed suddenly once their bodies reached a breaking point, unable to reconcile the stimulant's demands with their own physical limits. Medical officers traveling with the divisions observed these symptoms but struggled to interpret them. The early days of the invasion were chaotic, and distinguishing between combat stress, lack of sleep, and drug-induced overload was nearly impossible. When soldiers collapsed, medics attributed it to exhaustion. When they became short-tempered or unsteady, it was blamed on nerves. Few considered the possibility that an entire medical crisis might be embedded within the army's rapid advance. Commanders, however, saw only results. The speed of the campaign aligned perfectly with Germany's strategic vision. Breakthroughs occurred faster than expected. Defensive lines crumbled before they could be reinforced. Polish logistics fell into disarray, under the pressure of unending German movement. The stimulant-fueled tempo of the invasion became an unintentional proof of concept. Blitzkrieg was not merely a doctrine, it was a chemical reality. As the campaign drew to a close in late September, the cost of this pace became more apparent. Soldiers who had taken multiple doses without rest experienced extreme crashes. Some slept for 12 to 20 hours once operations slowed. Others experienced confusion or trembling that persisted for days. A few suffered psychological disturbances that field doctors could not explain. But these consequences were overshadowed by victory. The Wehrmacht had conquered Poland in weeks, fulfilling Hitler's expectations and reinforcing the belief that rapid, continuous movement was the future of warfare. Few asked whether such movement was sustainable. Fewer still questioned the drug that made it possible. The Blitzkrieg had worked, and so had Pervitin. The connection, though largely unspoken, was undeniable. The invasion of Poland was the first campaign fought under the influence of widespread stimulant use. It would not be the last. The months following the conquest of Poland were marked by an uneasy stillness along the Western Front. Newspapers called it the Sitzkrieg, the sit-down war, a period of waiting in muddy trenches and fortified bunkers stretching from the North Sea to the Maginot Line. But inside Germany, the Wehrmacht was preparing for something far different. A campaign that would require unmatched speed, endurance, and precision. And Pervitin, already proven during the Polish campaign, became an unspoken foundation for the operation that lay ahead. The invasion of France and the Low Countries demanded a tempo unprecedented in modern warfare. Plans required entire divisions to move with lightning speed through terrain considered unsuitable for tanks, then continue advancing before the enemy had time to react. The cornerstone of the strategy was momentum, uninterrupted, unforgiving momentum. To maintain it, the soldiers would need more than training and discipline. They would need wakefulness that stretched far beyond normal human limits. As the Wehrmacht prepared, supply officers packed stimulant tablets into every level of the chain of command. Ration kits were updated. Field medics were instructed to issue Pervitin during extended marches or before night operations. Officers received quiet guidance. Keep your men moving. Keep their minds sharp. Don't let exhaustion steal the tempo. The drug, once a supplement, had become as routine as ammunition. This chemical preparation mattered most in the early days of the assault through the Low Countries. In Belgium, Dutch and French forces expected the Germans to advance at a predictable pace, slowing at night or after long periods of movement. Instead, they faced soldiers who pushed forward without pause, crossing rivers, fields, and road networks for hours beyond what normal units could endure. Infantry marched through the night, pushing over 40, sometimes 50 kilometers without collapsing. Officers reported men staying awake for 2 full days, eyes bright, steps steady, their minds focused with an unnatural clarity. Tank crews again performed at the extremes of human endurance. The assault through the Ardennes, a route French strategists believed impassable for large armoured units, was made possible not only by daring planning, but by the ability of panzer crews to operate without sleep. Confined to steel compartments, breathing oil and exhaust, the men drove their vehicles over rough forest paths and narrow roads with relentless focus. Stimulated by Pervitin, they manoeuvred as if fatigued reactions had been chemically erased. Within infantry units, the effects were just as evident. Marching columns moved with a mechanical rhythm long after midnight. Soldiers described an eerie wakefulness, the ability to march in darkness as though it were day, to feel energized despite having slept little or not at all. One lieutenant noted that his men moved as if the night were irrelevant, a remark that encapsulated how deeply stimulants had shaped the Wehrmacht's tempo. Yet the strain was visible beneath the surface. After 30 or 40 hours without rest, some soldiers began to show signs of overstimulation, shaking hands, chattering speech, irrational focus on small details. A few marched mechanically, barely responding to commands, unless shouted directly into their faces. Others experienced sudden crashes, collapsing into ditches, falling asleep on their feet, or drifting into hallucinations made worse by darkness and stress. These episodes were often dismissed as battle fatigue or the fog of war, but medics recognized a deeper cause: the body rebelling against chemical coercion. Still, the overall effect was undeniable. The Allied forces were overwhelmed by the sheer pace of the German advance. Defensive plans collapsed, communications faltered, and morale suffered as soldiers realized the enemy simply did not stop. German troops seemed capable of marching, fighting, and maneuvering through night and day without rest. Behind this illusion of superhuman endurance lay a simple truth: methamphetamine had reshaped the battlefield. By the time German units reached the Meuse River and prepared for the decisive breakthrough at Sedan, the pattern was clear. The Wehrmacht's ability to compress time to turn days into continuous operational windows depended heavily on the stimulant that had quietly become part of their identity. The long march to the west was not simply a physical advance. It was a chemically sustained surge, one that would define the early victories of the German war machine and mask the cracks forming beneath its relentless momentum. The decision to send armored divisions through the Ardennes was one of the most daring and risky strategic choices made by the German High Command. The forested region, dense with narrow roads and steep ravines, was widely considered unsuitable for large-scale mechanized movement. French planners believed the terrain itself would prevent any rapid penetration. But inside German headquarters, a different calculation was being made. The obstacle was not the forest, it was human endurance. And that, commanders believed, could be chemically overridden. The assault began under cover of darkness. Columns of tanks, trucks, artillery, and infantry stretched across the German border, funneling into twisting forest roads that seemed barely capable of supporting civilian traffic, let alone an advancing army. The routes were cramped, visibility was limited, and the slightest disruption threatened to cause traffic jams stretching for kilometers. The operation demanded perfect synchronization and uninterrupted momentum, a feat no army had ever attempted at this scale. This is where Pervitin became more than a chemical asset. It became the invisible force holding the operation together. Panzer crews, already accustomed to long hours inside metal compartments, were issued stimulant tablets before entering the forest. Some had not slept since the previous morning. Others had slept only briefly. Knowing the narrow schedule offered no room for delay, the drug sharpened their senses, keeping them alert as they navigated muddy paths, unexpected turns, and bottlenecks where tanks crawled forward at a pace that tested patience and concentration. Truck drivers transporting fuel and ammunition relied heavily on the drug. Their task was among the most critical. Without continuous delivery of supplies, the armored thrust would stall inside the forest, trapped and vulnerable. Many drivers pushed through 30 to 40 hours of near-continuous movement, gripping the wheel with trembling hands while the stimulant kept their minds from drifting into exhaustion. They described a surreal clarity, a sense of moving through the trees on instinct, as though the forest itself blurred around them. Infantry, marching alongside the armored columns, experienced similar effects. The trails were uneven, the humidity oppressive, and the terrain demanding. Normally, troops forced to march through such conditions would require extended rest. Instead, Pervitin pushed them forward with a tempo that defied the reality of the environment. Sleep became optional. Fatigue was suppressed. Orders echoed through the forest in the middle of the night, and columns adjusted course instantly, without the sluggishness that usually set in after long marches. Yet beneath this remarkable cohesion, strain simmered. Soldiers who had taken multiple tablets without pause began to show signs of overstimulation. Rapid speech, shaking fingers, and a restless energy that verged on agitation. Some walked with glassy eyes, hyper-focused on the path ahead, but detached from their surroundings. Others experienced sudden emotional swings, bursts of aggression, or moments of uncharacteristic silence. Medics assigned to support the operation reported a spike in complaints, heart palpitations, nausea, and sudden waves of anxiety. Still, the stimulant's benefits overshadowed these warnings. The pace held, the columns continued moving, and the element of surprise, the cornerstone of the operation, remained intact. By the third day, the German forces emerged from the forest, not depleted and disoriented as the French High Command had predicted, but positioned for a coordinated assault on the Meuse River. The speed of their advance caught French commanders off guard. They had assumed any enemy force attempting such a passage would arrive, fragmented and exhausted. Instead, German divisions appeared with a cohesion that felt impossible, as if the forest had not slowed them at all. In truth, it had slowed them. The terrain was brutal, the roads barely functional, but the human factor, the one variable every planner feared, had been chemically manipulated. The pills kept the drivers awake, the tank crews sharp, and the infantry moving. The stimulant made the impossible merely difficult, and the difficult achievable. Crossing the Ardennes became one of the most striking examples of chemically enhanced warfare. It proved that human endurance could be stretched, distorted, and weaponized, not by training alone, but by methamphetamine. The consequences of that choice would echo far beyond the forest. The success brought by stimulants in these early days would set expectations for future operations, expectations the human body could not always meet. When German forces emerged from the Ardennes and approached the Meuse River near Sedan, they arrived at a moment that would define the success or failure of the entire Western campaign. The strategy depended on achieving a breakthrough so sudden, so overwhelming, that France's defences would crumble before they could reorganize. German planners had pored over maps, studied terrain, and calculated artillery ranges, but beneath all the planning was a factor rarely acknowledged: the soldiers' chemically sustained ability to reach the river with enough strength, focus, and wakefulness to strike immediately. The men who approached Sedan were not rested. Many had been awake for more than 30 hours, some for nearly 50, their eyes sharp but hollow from the constant push through forests, ravines, and washed-out roads. Under normal circumstances, their bodies would have demanded rest, their minds would have dulled, their coordination would have faltered. But Pervitin had suppressed those limits, allowing the Wehrmacht to reach the Meuse at a tempo that defied Allied expectations. The French defenders believed they had time. Reconnaissance reports suggested German units were still bogged down in the forest, struggling to move heavy equipment to the front. Commanders assumed the enemy would require a full day, perhaps more, to reorganize before attempting a major assault. This miscalculation stemmed from a simple belief: no army could fight effectively after such a grueling march. Yet the Germans were already assembling assault boats. Infantry divisions, operating on thin rations and stimulant-supported wakefulness, moved with mechanical precision as they prepared to cross the river. Engineers assembled pontoons and inflatable boats in near silence, their hands steady despite the tremors some felt beneath their skin. Artillery units, staffed by crews who had taken Pervitin during the advance, positioned their guns with rapid efficiency. Their calculations were quick, their reactions unnaturally sharp. Officers noted the speed, but did not question its cause. By dawn, the assault began. German artillery launched a blistering barrage across the river, creating a curtain of fire meant to disorient and overwhelm French defenders. The gunners, many awake far longer than medically advisable, maintained a rate of fire that stunned even their own officers. Their concentration held a chemically fortified tunnel vision, born of exhaustion and stimulant-driven clarity. As the shells fell, assault teams paddled across the Meuse in small, fragile boats. Under normal conditions, such an operation demanded precision and calm qualities rarely found in men deprived of sleep. But those under Pervitin felt a peculiar sense of alertness, a sharpened focus that drowned out fear and fatigue. Some later described feeling detached from their own exhaustion, as if another hand were guiding them through the motions. On the opposite bank, French resistance was fierce but fragmented. Defenders were stunned not only by the speed of the assault, but by the relentlessness of it. German units pressed forward without hesitation, advancing through gunfire, climbing embankments, and establishing bridgeheads with a determination that bordered on reckless. Some soldiers moved with a fury that surprised even their own officers, a stimulant-fueled aggression that made them push harder, charge faster, react quicker. Yet even as the Germans overwhelmed the initial defenses, cracks appeared beneath the surface of their performance. A number of soldiers collapsed mid-assault, their bodies suddenly unable to sustain the stimulant's demands. Others became disoriented once the drug's effects began to fade, requiring medics to drag them out of harm's way. A few experienced moments of confusion, hearing phantom orders or misinterpreting commands. But the momentum of the assault, driven by overwhelming numbers and the shock effect, carried the operation forward. By midday, the bridgeheads were secure. Engineers rushed to construct pontoon bridges, enabling tanks and heavy equipment to cross the river. The breakthrough at Sedan, a moment that reshaped the entire war, had been achieved through a combination of bold strategy, tight timing, and the altered physiology of thousands of soldiers whose endurance had been stretched beyond natural limits. What followed was celebrated as tactical brilliance. Few asked why the men had been able to fight with such intensity after sleepless nights. Fewer still understood that methamphetamine had played a silent role in altering not only human performance, but the very tempo of Blitzkrieg. The road to Sedan was not just a strategic triumph. It was one of the first great victories of chemically enhanced warfare, a victory purchased at a price the soldiers had not yet begun to pay. The collapse of France in the spring of 1940 stunned the watching world. To Allied observers, the German victory appeared almost supernatural in speed and precision, as though an army had moved faster than strategy, faster than terrain, faster than fatigue itself. Behind headlines praising lightning war, few understood the role human endurance played in sustaining such relentless momentum, and fewer still recognized that this endurance had been chemically engineered. After the breakthrough at Sedan, German divisions surged westward with a pace that seemed impossible. Infantry marched for hours without rest. Tank crews drove through the night with unwavering focus, and reconnaissance units covered extraordinary distances, reporting enemy positions before French commanders fully grasped the scale of the breach. Blitzkrieg, often understood as doctrine, was equally a test of stamina, a race against time in which sleep could not be permitted, hesitation could not be tolerated, and exhaustion had to be suppressed at any cost. Within this race, Pervitin became an indispensable instrument. As German forces pressed into the French interior, the stimulant's influence became increasingly visible. Infantry, who had already endured sleepless marches through the Ardennes, continued advancing with a mechanical rhythm, their boots hitting the roads in perfectly synchronized steps long after natural fatigue should have rendered them sluggish. Officers distributed tablets at the beginning of each major push, reinforcing the unspoken expectation that their men be awake, aware, and aggressive at all hours. Some units marched nearly 60 kilometers in a single day, an achievement that defied physiology. Soldiers later recalled feeling detached from their own exhaustion, aware that they were tired, but unable to truly feel it. Their minds remained sharp, their reactions quick, their determination heightened by the stimulant's grip. For junior officers tasked with maintaining pace, the drug became a silent ally, keeping their companies cohesive through grueling conditions. Tank crews, already pushed to their limits in the Ardennes, now operated with even more extreme demands. Inside cramped compartments, fumes from fuel and ammunition mixed with sweat and the sharp tension that filled every moment of armored warfare. Yet crews stayed awake for 30, 40, sometimes 50 hours, navigating roads, firing guns, and coordinating maneuvers with a precision that stunned the Allies. Reports surfaced of tank commanders who had gone so long without sleep that their voices cracked from strain, yet their eyes remained wide, their decisions quick. For the Allies, the German tempo became disorienting. French and British units often prepared defences assuming German troops would need rest. But again and again, those defences were overrun during hours when the enemy should have been sleeping. Positions believed secure during the night were attacked at dawn by divisions that had marched straight through darkness. One French officer later remarked, "It felt as though they never stopped. They came at us as if exhaustion did not exist." But beneath the outward success, medical officers saw warning signs. Soldiers who had taken multiple doses without rest, experienced trembling hands, sudden bursts of aggression, or moments of unsettling calm. Some collapsed mid-march, dropping to the ground as if their bodies had simply run out of fuel. Others fell asleep, standing up, once the drug's effects wore off, only to be jolted awake by officers pushing them forward. Still, the operational machine pushed on. Victory overshadowed everything: fatigue, crashes, psychological strain. Commanders credited doctrine and morale for the army's performance. Strategy briefs emphasized speed and surprise, ignoring the chemical quietness that made such pacing possible. By mid-June, France, a nation believed to possess one of the strongest armies in the world, had crumbled. German soldiers marched into Paris not as rested conquerors, but as chemically strained men whose bodies had been driven to unnatural extremes. Historians often attribute the fall of France to flawed strategy, outdated doctrines, and political confusion. But the human factor, the ability of German troops to sustain continuous movement far beyond natural limits, played a decisive, if largely hidden, role. Pervitin did not win the campaign alone, but it changed the tempo of war, altering what an army could physically accomplish in a condensed window of time. The victory in France, swift and overwhelming, became the defining triumph of chemically enhanced warfare, a triumph whose long-term costs remained invisible beneath the euphoria of conquest. The men had marched, driven, and fought as though sleep were optional. Soon, the bill for that illusion would begin to surface. The most striking transformation brought about by Pervitin during the early war years was not found on wide roads or open battlefields, but in the hours when the world normally slept. Night, once a natural barrier to military operations, became an operational window for the Wehrmacht. Under normal conditions, armies slowed after sunset. Exhaustion, darkness, and the psychological weight of the unknown created natural pauses in combat. Commanders historically accepted this rhythm: daylight for movement, night for rest and consolidation. The German army, fortified by stimulants, quietly abandoned that rhythm. As operations unfolded across Belgium and France, entire divisions moved through the night with a precision that defied historical precedent. Marches began at sunset and continued until dawn. Assaults launched in darkness achieved breakthroughs that would have been unthinkable for tired, sleep-deprived soldiers. German forces used the night not as a pause, but as a tool, a weapon sharpened by chemistry. For infantry, the change was immediately felt. Night marches, once grueling and disorienting, became almost routine. Pervitin kept men alert, their senses unnaturally focused on the path ahead. Soldiers described being able to distinguish terrain features in the dark, react quickly to whispered commands, and maintain formation without the usual stumbling or lag that came with fatigue. The stimulant dulled the body's pleas for rest, replacing them with a wired clarity that allowed men to march for hours under the faint glow of moonlight or scattered lantern beams. The psychological shift was profound. Instead of dreading night movement, soldiers experienced an eerie confidence, a sense that darkness no longer diminished them. One corporal later recalled, "It felt as though night was ours. The French slept. We did not." Tank crews, too, took advantage of the extended wakefulness. Operating armored vehicles in the dark had always been hazardous, but stimulant-enhanced alertness allowed crews to maneuver with surprising accuracy. Tank commanders stayed awake longer, scanning for threats, issuing commands, and keeping units cohesive through stretches of terrain where a single mistake could trigger a disastrous pileup of vehicles. Inside the claustrophobic compartments of panzers, where visibility was already limited and fatigue could quickly turn fatal, Pervitin provided a lifeline, or so it seemed. Reconnaissance units benefited even more dramatically. Night reconnaissance had historically been unreliable due to fatigue, anxiety, and the brain's natural drop in alertness. But German scouts, under the drug's influence, rode their motorcycles or light vehicles across blackened countryside with startling confidence. They returned with detailed intelligence gathered during hours the enemy assumed were safe. French and British forces, relying on conventional expectations of human endurance, found themselves repeatedly caught off guard. But the stimulant's enhancement of night operations came with hidden costs. Medics observed a rise in panic attacks as soldiers pushed beyond 30 or 40 hours without meaningful sleep. Some men reported seeing shapes moving in the darkness, trees shifting, shadows flickering, phantom figures darting between buildings. Others reacted aggressively to sudden noises, mistaking them for enemy fire. In some cases, overstimulated soldiers fired their weapons at imagined threats, revealing their positions or jeopardizing entire units. Coordination began to fray in subtle ways. A few men lagged unexpectedly, their bodies suddenly overriding the chemical suppression of fatigue. Others marched robotically, unresponsive except to direct physical stimulus. Officers noted moments where entire squads became strangely irritable, arguing over minor issues in a way that suggested mental strain rather than military discipline. Yet none of these cracks slowed the pace of operations. German commanders saw the night as an opportunity, a chance to gain ground while the enemy slept. The success of Pervitin-enhanced night operations validated their belief that fatigue was a variable that could be chemically removed from the battlefield. The Allies, unprepared for an enemy that treated darkness as daylight, struggled to adapt. Defensive plans collapsed. Communication networks faltered. Soldiers who had relied on the night for safety found themselves overwhelmed by forces that advanced with uncanny stamina. Night operations had become a defining element of Blitzkrieg, enabled not only by doctrine and daring, but by a stimulant that turned rest into a luxury and wakefulness into a weapon. In the shadowed hours of the early war, German soldiers marched, fought, and maneuvered as though exhaustion had been erased. The darkness did not slow them. It empowered them, at least for a time. The consequences, as always, would come later. No branch of the German military embraced Pervitin more eagerly or more dangerously than the Luftwaffe. Aviation demanded a level of concentration and endurance far beyond that of ground operations. Pilots were expected to navigate at high speed, endure violent maneuvers, track enemy aircraft in three-dimensional space, and make split-second decisions where a moment's hesitation meant death. Fatigue in the cockpit was unforgiving. A single lapse of attention could send a fighter spinning into a field or a bomber drifting into enemy fire. To the Luftwaffe's medical officers, stimulants seemed like a solution to these limitations, a chemical guarantee that pilots would remain sharp during the long, punishing missions that defined the early war. By 1940, Pervitin had become a quiet companion to aircrews. Bomber formations flying night raids over France and the Low Countries often consumed tablets before takeoff. The flights were long, the risks high, and the need for sustained alertness absolute. Pilots reported that the stimulant sharpened their senses, steadied their focus, and gave them confidence when fatigue threatened to dull their instincts. In fighter squadrons, the effect was even more pronounced. Luftwaffe aces operated under extreme physical and psychological strain, enduring tight turns, high G-forces, engine vibration, and the constant threat of death. After hours of combat operations, adrenaline alone was not enough. Stimulants bridged the gap, allowing pilots to scramble repeatedly, engage enemy aircraft with uncanny precision, and patrol skies into the late hours of the night. Commanders praised this performance. Reports noted pilots who remained airborne far longer than expected, flying back-to-back sorties with minimal rest. Some embarked on missions lasting 10, 12, even 15 hours, relying on Pervitin to maintain awareness and prevent the microsleep episodes that often plague fatigued aviators. The drug created an illusion of limitless stamina, an invaluable asset in the Luftwaffe's early campaigns. But beneath the confidence lay growing instability. Medical officers began noticing erratic behavior among pilots who used Pervitin frequently. Some displayed heightened aggression, diving into daring attacks or pursuing enemy fighters longer than tactical sense allowed. Others reported trembling hands during landings, an alarming symptom in a profession where precision was everything. A few pilots experienced moments of euphoria mid-flight, followed by sudden drops into irritability or despondence once the drug's effects began to fade. fatigue became harder to manage. After the stimulant wore off, pilots often crashed into deep, almost uncontrollable sleep, sometimes within minutes of landing their aircraft. Others lay awake through the night, unable to calm the racing thoughts the drug triggered. Squadron leaders complained of men who appeared sharp one day and emotionally unstable the next. Hallucinations also surfaced, especially during night operations. Some pilots reported seeing enemy aircraft that did not exist, mistaking clouds for fighters or blinking lights for anti-aircraft fire. These distortions, though rarely documented officially, led to dangerous, evasive maneuvers that wasted fuel and jeopardized formations. In at least one recorded instance, an overstimulated pilot broke formation during a mission, convinced he had spotted an ambush in the clouds. His aircraft vanished into darkness and never returned. Still, the Luftwaffe pressed on. The demands of Blitzkrieg required relentless air support, reconnaissance, troop escort, bombing runs, and defensive patrols. There was no time to consider long-term consequences. The stimulant's benefits in maintaining operational tempo overshadowed every concern raised by medical staff. As the war widened, Luftwaffe pilots found themselves flying longer missions against stronger opposition, often without rest between operations. Pervitin became not just a tool, but a coping mechanism, a way to push through exhaustion that no training regimen could truly prepare them for. By the time Germany turned its attention toward Britain and later the Soviet Union, Luftwaffe pilots were already showing signs of chemical strain. Irritability, insomnia, emotional volatility, and increasing dependency on the tablet that had once promised clarity. In the cockpit, the world moved quickly. The sky demanded perfection. And for a brief moment in the early war, Pervitin made that perfection seem achievable. But as the battles grew longer and the stakes higher, the drug's hidden cost would reveal itself in the shaking hands of exhausted pilots, in the misjudged maneuvers, and in the growing realization that no stimulant could forever outrun the limits of the human mind. As Germany's early victories swept across Europe, a narrative began to take shape, one that blended propaganda, battlefield rumors, and the awe of stunned observers. Allied soldiers described facing opponents who seemed unnaturally alert, who attacked at dawn after marching through the night, who fought with a frenzy that felt beyond ordinary human capability. Newspapers began whispering about a superior German soldier. Civilians spoke of a Wehrmacht infused with discipline and genetic strength. Nazi propaganda fanned these beliefs, portraying its troops as the pinnacle of physical and psychological endurance. Yet beneath this myth was a quieter truth. Many of these superhuman traits were the byproduct of a stimulant that blurred the line between endurance and desperation. In the Wehrmacht's ranks, the myth formed organically. Soldiers who took Pervitin reported feeling sharper, stronger, and more decisive. Exhaustion no longer crippled them. Hunger faded. Fear dulled. In the fog of war, it was easy for troops to mistake chemically induced wakefulness for authentic strength. Officers reinforced this belief, praising units that achieved breakthrough after breakthrough, framing their performance not as chemically enhanced but as proof of German superiority. The stimulant became invisible, its effects absorbed into a growing cultural idea of exceptionalism. Propaganda ministries capitalized on this. Films and posters depicted German soldiers as tireless, unbreakable, forged by discipline and bloodline. They marched endlessly under storm clouds, crossed rivers with unstoppable force, and maneuvered tanks through terrain others considered impassable. None of these images mentioned the tablet tucked into ration kits, dissolving quietly in the bloodstream. The myth spread to the Allies as well. British and French soldiers who encountered the relentless pace of German advances often described their opponents with a mixture of bewilderment and fear. They saw men who did not rest when expected, who attacked with surprising aggression, and who seemed immune to the natural rhythm of fatigue that governed warfare for centuries. Commanders speculated that German training was inhumanly strict, or that their enemy was psychologically conditioned for brutality. Few considered chemistry as the cause. Within Germany, the idea of the super soldier served a political purpose. It reinforced the regime's belief in destiny and racial hierarchy. It justified the rapid expansion of military ambitions. It concealed the reality that many troops were fighting on chemistry, not ideology. And it protected the illusion that the Wehrmacht's success was sustainable. But cracks soon appeared. Soldiers who initially embraced the stimulant began to rely on it in ways that unsettled their officers. Some requested tablets before even minor operations, convinced their performance would falter without them. Others consumed more than the recommended dose, chasing the same intensity they experienced during earlier victories. When the drug's effects inevitably faded, these men experienced emotional crashes that contradicted the myth of tireless strength: depression, paranoia, irritability, even uncontrollable shaking. Medical units quietly documented the fallout. Cases of sudden breakdowns increased. A few soldiers collapsed during simple drills, their bodies depleted after days of stimulant-supported exertion. Others became unpredictable, reacting with aggression or confusion when stressed. These symptoms did not match the image of the unbreakable German warrior, yet they were becoming increasingly common. Even commanders who benefited from the myth felt its burden. Blitzkrieg demanded soldiers who could move constantly, react instantly, and never slow down. As long as victories came quickly, the illusion held. But behind the scenes, officers noticed that sustaining such momentum required repeated stimulant use. The myth of the super soldier had created a military tempo that no human chemically enhanced or not could maintain indefinitely. Still, the narrative persisted. Germany wanted its enemies to believe its army was unstoppable. It wanted its soldiers to believe they were exceptional. And it wanted the world to see its victories as proof of superiority, not the product of a pill that allowed men to outrun their bodies for brief, costly bursts. The myth strengthened morale, sharpened fear, and fed ideology. But like all myths, it hid a dangerous truth. The super soldier was not a product of nature or destiny, but of chemistry. And chemistry had limits. The world would soon witness what happened when a myth outran the reality beneath it. In the early triumphs of Blitzkrieg, speed became the signature of the Wehrmacht, the element that stunned opponents, collapsed defensive lines, and allowed Germany to seize territory at a pace unseen in modern warfare. But behind the headlines and military communiques lay a truth that planners understood only dimly at first. Every kilometre gained at unnatural tempo carried a hidden cost, and every hour stolen from sleep with a stimulant created a debt the army would eventually be forced to pay. At the operational level, the emphasis on speed reshaped planning. Commanders scheduled maneuvers with the assumption that their troops could continue marching long after exhaustion should have set in. They expected tank crews to drive through the night, infantry to move immediately after major assaults, and reconnaissance units to conduct back-to-back missions without rest. This tempo was sustainable only because Pervitin artificially extended the soldiers' capacity to function. The drug did not make men stronger. It merely delayed the moment their bodies demanded rest, pushing that moment into the future, where consequences accumulated. The first strategic cost appeared in logistics. Blitzkrieg, despite its reputation for spontaneity, depended on complex and fragile supply chains. Fuel, ammunition, food, and replacement parts had to reach the front at the same accelerated pace as the troops themselves. When soldiers, enhanced by stimulants, marched farther and faster than expected, supply units struggled to keep up. Trucks broke down under constant strain. Drivers, themselves often using Pervitin, pushed beyond their limits and made fatal mistakes, missing turns, crashing into ditches, or falling asleep at the wheel once the drug wore off. In some areas, armoured spearheads outran not only their supplies but their support infantry, creating dangerous gaps as they surged ahead. The stimulant-enabled tempo exceeded what Germany's infrastructure could consistently sustain. And while the Allies interpreted the momentum as a sign of German invincibility, officers on the ground saw the cracks forming moments where rapid advances nearly collapsed into chaos. Another cost emerged within the soldiers themselves. The more the Wehrmacht relied on Pervitin, the more its units became vulnerable to collective crashes. Stimulants could suppress fatigue, but they could not erase it. When the drug's effects faded, often without warning, entire companies experienced simultaneous exhaustion. Soldiers collapsed during marches. Others fell into deep, sudden sleep that no shouting or gunfire could cut through. In several instances, units during critical operations were forced to halt unexpectedly because their men simply could not continue. Commanders grew frustrated. They saw moments where troops who had performed with machine-like efficiency during key breakthroughs were suddenly lethargic, irritable, or mentally fogged, unable to follow orders with their usual sharpness. This inconsistency made planning unpredictable. German doctrine relied on synchronized movement. Pervitin created a battlefield of fluctuating human capability. Psychologically, the costs were equally severe. Prolonged stimulant use increased stress, aggression, and emotional volatility. Soldiers who once showed discipline and composure became prone to impulsive decisions and sudden outbursts. Patrols reported fights breaking out within squads over minor disputes. Officers noted a rise in disciplinary cases tied to agitation and disobedience. The chemical edge that helped Germany win early victories also eroded the stability of its troops. Strategically, the greatest cost was conceptual. The Wehrmacht built its doctrine around a pace of warfare that was not naturally sustainable. Victories in Poland, France, and the Low Countries created an expectation that future campaigns could replicate the same velocity. But Blitzkrieg's early success was shaped not only by planning and mechanization, it was shaped by the unprecedented stimulant-fueled endurance of the soldiers executing it. When Germany later faced larger, more resilient enemies and longer supply lines, the assumption of limitless tempo became a strategic liability. In the short term, stimulants accelerated victory. In the long term, they distorted Germany's perception of its own capabilities. Pervitin had enabled the Wehrmacht to skip rest, outrun logic, and push its men past human limits. But speed created its own fragility. The faster an army moved, the more catastrophic the consequences when it finally slowed. The true cost of speed would reveal itself as the war expanded when Germany discovered what happened after a chemically enhanced force met an enemy it could not outrun. By the summer of 1940, as the Wehrmacht celebrated victories that reshaped Europe's map, the first internal fractures began to appear subtle at first, then increasingly difficult to ignore. The routine use of Pervitin had carried German forces through their earliest campaigns with astonishing speed. But beneath the triumphs lay an accumulating burden: restless minds, unstable tempers, and bodies pushed far beyond their natural thresholds. In infantry units, officers noticed an unsettling pattern. Soldiers who had performed with machine-like efficiency during the Polish and French campaigns began showing signs of mental and physical wear. Some men struggled to sleep even when the opportunity arose, lying awake for hours with their hearts pounding, their thoughts racing. Others experienced sudden emotional crashes, falling into deep lethargy or bouts of irritability that made simple orders difficult to carry out. A few soldiers reported something more alarming: moments of disorientation. They described hearing whispers during night marches or seeing flickering shapes along the roadside, illusions born not of fear, but of a mind overstimulated and depleted. Field medics dismissed these episodes as fatigue or combat stress, unaware of how deeply the stimulant had altered the soldiers' perception. Medical officers began documenting elevated heart rates, tremors, and prolonged insomnia among troops who admitted regular stimulant use. But these reports rarely traveled far up the chain of command. The High Command remained focused on the larger strategic picture, viewing the chemical aid not as a threat, but as a tool that had helped secure unprecedented victories. Concerns raised by physicians were often sidelined, minimized, or buried beneath glowing assessments of operational success. The Luftwaffe faced its own issues. Pilots who had flown repeated sorties over Britain and France with Pervitin's support now struggled with psychological volatility. Some became uncharacteristically aggressive in the cockpit, diving too steeply into attacks or pursuing enemy aircraft beyond sensible limits. Others expressed sudden doubt or dread, their confidence evaporating as the drug's highs gave way to crushing lows. Squadron leaders noted the changes but felt powerless to intervene. The demands of the air war offered no room for rest or recovery. Logistical units, too, showed strain. Drivers who had once pushed through long stretches of night with stimulant-induced clarity were making errors, missing turns, misjudging distances, or crashing from sudden microsleep episodes once the drug wore off. The supply chain, the quiet backbone of Blitzkrieg, began to wobble under the weight of human exhaustion masked by chemistry. Even among officers, stimulant use became problematic. Pervitin had subtly shifted expectations. Commanders planned operations assuming their men could function indefinitely without sleep. When troops faltered, as they inevitably did, officers grew frustrated, sometimes mistaking chemical crashes for indiscipline. This misunderstanding deepened the strain between command and frontline soldiers. Within barracks and billets, whispered conversations reflected the growing unease. Soldiers joked about feeling hollow after the drug wore off, or spoke of dreams so vivid they blurred into waking moments. A few expressed fear about how dependent they had become. One corporal wrote in a letter home, "When the pill stops, everything stops. My legs feel heavy. My head is full of fog. I feel like a different person." But these cracks were overshadowed by the glow of victory. Germany had achieved in months what military planners across Europe believed impossible. Territories were conquered, governments toppled, and the myth of the Wehrmacht's unstoppable momentum grew. No one wanted to believe that the engine driving these victories was beginning to burn itself out. And so, the risks went largely unacknowledged. The first cracks, though faint, signaled a deeper truth. The Wehrmacht had built its initial success on a foundation of chemically sustained momentum. That foundation, once assumed stable, was already showing signs of strain. As the war widened, and as Germany prepared to turn east toward its greatest challenge, those cracks would spread, deepening into fractures that no stimulant could conceal. The illusion of invincibility was beginning to fade. The reckoning had only just begun. As the pace of operations slowed during brief pauses between campaigns, the hidden cost of Germany's chemically accelerated warfare began to surface with painful clarity. Soldiers who had marched, fought, and maneuvered on little more than adrenaline and Pervitin now confronted the overdue bill for their borrowed stamina. What the stimulant had concealed for days came roaring back with a force that exposed the limits of both body and mind. The first sign was exhaustion, not the ordinary fatigue familiar to every soldier, but a collapse so profound it resembled illness. Men who had seemed tireless during the invasions of Poland and France now slept for 12, even 20 hours once the pressure eased. Some fell asleep mid-conversation. Others nodded off while eating, their spoons slipping from their hands. Entire squads were found slumped against walls, asleep where they had stood moments earlier. Officers who once praised their men's relentless energy now struggled to rouse them. Field medics were puzzled. Nothing in their training prepared them for soldiers who went from near hyperactivity to near unconsciousness overnight. At first, they blamed the stress of combat, believing the body simply collapsed once immediate danger passed. But the pattern was unmistakable. Crashes occurred most frequently among units known to have received frequent stimulant doses during operations. Worse yet were the psychological effects. Some soldiers awoke from long crashes disoriented and irritable, their tempers volatile and their thoughts sluggish. A few appeared almost hungover, their minds fogged, their movements clumsy. Others experienced a sudden, crushing depression that left them sitting alone, staring into the distance without speaking. These men had pushed their minds beyond natural limits, and now their brains struggled to regain balance. Commanders noted an increase in emotional instability. Men snapped at trivial commands. Fights broke out over minor disagreements. Soldiers, who had once displayed discipline and cohesion, became erratic, unpredictable, or withdrawn. A sergeant in one regiment reported that his platoon seemed drained of all spirit, a stark contrast to the aggressive drive they had shown just weeks earlier. Some crashes manifested as anxiety. Soldiers reported feeling suddenly overwhelmed by dread, convinced that danger lurked even in safe rear areas. A few experienced panic attacks so severe they were temporarily removed from duty. Others described vivid nightmares, disturbing visions that blurred with memories of battle. Whether these nightmares stemmed from trauma or from the stimulant's lingering neurological effects, medics could not say. Hallucinations also became more frequent. Soldiers recovering from extended Pervitin use sometimes saw movement in shadows or heard whispers in empty rooms. These episodes were usually brief, but they unsettled even the most seasoned officers. The line between fatigue-induced hallucination and stimulant withdrawal blurred, leaving medical staff unsure how to diagnose the growing trend. The crashes also had operational consequences. Units rotated into reserve positions often required extra days, sometimes weeks, to regain full effectiveness. When orders came to prepare for new offensives, many soldiers were still mentally and physically drained. Officers struggled to rebuild morale. Some attempted to conceal the severity of the crashes to avoid scrutiny from higher command. But the high command faced its own problem. The Wehrmacht had set a precedent it could not sustain. Early campaigns had been won with the help of chemically enhanced speed, leading Hitler and his senior staff to expect similar momentum in future operations. But beneath the polished reports of victory, frontline officers increasingly admitted quietly, never officially, that their men could not maintain the same pace without stimulants, and when those stimulants ran out, the army slowed. The crash after the high revealed a dangerous truth. Pervitin had allowed German forces to outrun exhaustion temporarily, but it could not erase the biological debt. Once the drug wore off, that debt returned with interest in the form of depleted strength, impaired judgment, unstable emotions, and a troubling reliance on chemical assistance. As Germany prepared for the next phase of the war, a campaign that would stretch across vast distances and demand endurance far beyond that required in the West, the Wehrmacht entered with an army already carrying hidden fractures. Men who had marched like machines were learning they were human after all. The stimulant had pushed them farther than they believed possible. Now, the crash reminded them of the price. As the war intensified and stimulant use became more routine, an unsettling phenomenon began spreading quietly through the ranks of the Wehrmacht. Soldiers reporting visions, distorted sounds, and shadows that moved in ways no enemy soldier ever could. Hallucinations, once dismissed as rare outliers, emerged as a growing consequence of prolonged stimulant use, layered atop exhaustion, stress, and the unrelenting rhythm of combat. These episodes surfaced gradually, almost imperceptibly at first. A sentry on night duty would report hearing footsteps in an empty tree line. A reconnaissance scout might insist he had seen figures crawling through fields that were later found untouched. Soldiers whispered about strange shapes flickering at the edge of their lantern light, shadows bending or shifting as though alive. Officers attributed these accounts to nerves, sleep deprivation, or the natural paranoia of war. Few connected them to the white tablets distributed so casually before every march, every night operation, every moment where wakefulness mattered more than rest. But as more men came forward, a pattern emerged. In the hours after multiple doses of Pervitin, especially following days with little sleep, many soldiers experienced a tightening around the edges of reality. Their senses heightened to unnatural levels. The snap of a twig sounded like a rifle bolt. The rustle of wind in grass seemed like whispered conversation. In the haze of stimulant-driven vigilance, the line between danger and imagination blurred. One infantryman later wrote that during a night patrol near the River Somme, he saw grey shapes moving between the ruins, only to discover at dawn that the ruins were empty. Another described seeing the silhouette of a French soldier crouched behind a wall, a figure so vivid he fired an entire magazine at it. When his comrades rushed to investigate, they found only broken stone and dust. He insisted the enemy had been there. His hands trembled as he reloaded, Tank crews reported similar incidents. Encased in steel, deprived of sleep, and riding the razor's edge of adrenaline and chemical stimulation, they began seeing phantom flashes in the periscope glass muzzle bursts that did not exist, movement where none was possible, enemy tanks materializing out of smoke only to vanish moments later. These illusions led to abrupt maneuvering, wasted ammunition, and moments of chaos during operations that demanded precision. In foxholes and trenches, whispers grew about the watchers imagined, silhouettes glimpsed in the periphery, especially during long nights when minds raced and sleep was chemically suppressed. Some soldiers became convinced they were being observed by unseen figures. Others sensed movement behind them when none was there. For a few, the hallucinations grew darker. Faces distorted by fear, shadows forming human shapes, or the eerie belief that the dead walked among the living. Medical officers, when they encountered these cases, recorded vague diagnoses: combat stress reaction, acute exhaustion, or temporary nervous disturbance. Very few acknowledged the role of stimulants explicitly. To do so would have demanded confronting an uncomfortable question: had the army itself created these symptoms through its reliance on Pervitin? The consequences were not merely psychological. Unchecked hallucinations translated into real danger. Sentries opened fire on imagined threats, revealing positions to the enemy. Patrols doubled back in confusion after chasing phantom sounds. Entire squads were thrown into disarray when a single overstimulated soldier mistook shadows for an ambush. Officers complained privately. Men who once followed orders with crisp clarity were becoming unpredictable, their judgment clouded by the combined fog of fatigue, fear, and chemistry. Yet even as hallucinations spread, frontline units continued receiving stimulant rations. The demands of war did not allow for hesitation. Commanders needed alert soldiers, not rested ones. The widening gulf between perception and reality among overstimulated troops was seen as a necessary risk, a byproduct of a tempo that had proven devastatingly effective against the enemy. Hallucinations on the front line revealed a grim truth the Wehrmacht was slow to confront. The human mind, when pushed beyond its limits through artificial means, begins to produce its own battlefield, one filled with imagined threats, phantom enemies, and shadows where none exist. The drug that once kept soldiers awake now began unraveling their grip on reality, and as the war expanded into harsher theaters, the line between illusion and danger grew perilously thin. When Germany launched its invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, the vastness of the Eastern Front stretched before the Wehrmacht like a cruel promise. It was a landscape of forests, marshlands, endless plains, and roads that seemed to dissolve into mud or dust depending on the season. It demanded endurance far beyond anything experienced in Western Europe. And, with that demand, came a new and dangerous consequence of the stimulant culture that had already taken hold: outright addiction. Pervitin, once issued selectively, now flowed through frontline units with alarming regularity. Officers, facing marches that spanned entire days, used the tablets to keep their companies moving. Drivers consumed them to stay awake at the wheel, guiding trucks over roads that rattled bones and snapped axles. Infantrymen swallowed them during night attacks, during long watches, or simply to endure the monotony of marching across fields that never seemed to end. In the trenches and foxholes carved into the hard soil of Belarus and Ukraine, the drug changed from a tool into a necessity. Soldiers began to ask for it by name. Some carried extra tablets acquired through bartering or from medics overwhelmed by requests. Men who had once taken Pervitin occasionally now consumed it routinely in the morning to shake off exhaustion, during marches to maintain pace, and at night to stay alert in the oppressive stillness where every rustle of grass felt like a threat. The psychological grip tightened as the brutal conditions of the Eastern Front wore down the mind. Days stretched into nights, nights into days. Sleep became fragmented, unpredictable, stolen in short bursts whenever the fighting subsided. Without stimulants, soldiers felt hollow, sluggish, unable to keep pace with demands. With stimulants, they felt sharp, or at least convinced themselves they were, and so the cycle deepened. Medics noticed the signs first. A growing number of soldiers arrived complaining of trembling hands, persistent headaches, or inability to sleep. Others showed emotional instability, sudden irritation, unexplained anger, or fits of laughter that made no sense in the cold, grim trenches. A few appeared dazed, their eyes unfocused, their reactions delayed. When questioned, some admitted taking more than the recommended dose. Others claimed they could not wake up without the drug. Addiction manifested differently depending on the soldier. Some became jittery and restless, pacing like caged animals during downtime. Others withdrew into themselves, staring into the distance with a vacancy that unnerved their comrades. A few men grew paranoid, convinced they were being watched, followed, or betrayed. These symptoms intensified during long periods without sleep, creating a dangerous mix of stimulant overload and combat stress. The most severe cases unnerved even the hardened officers. Soldiers who had taken too much Pervitin sometimes collapsed suddenly, their bodies unable to withstand the strain. Others broke down mentally, shaking uncontrollably, screaming in confusion, or experiencing full psychotic episodes. One infantryman near Smolensk was found wandering between the lines at dawn, murmuring incoherently and clutching a rifle with no magazine. Another, overwhelmed by hallucinations, fired his weapon blindly into the forest, nearly triggering a friendly fire incident. Yet despite these consequences, the demand for Pervitin only grew. The Eastern Front devoured stamina, sanity, and spirit. Soldiers learned quickly that without the stimulant, they fell behind in marching, in fighting, in surviving. Officers, under pressure to maintain offensive momentum, continued distributing tablets even to men who showed signs of dependency. The logic was grim but simple. The war required movement, and movement required wakefulness. Supply officers struggled to keep up. Letters from frontline units frequently included subtle requests for more stimulants. Some commanders issued tablets even when medical officers protested. Others rationed them strictly, aware of the consequences but unable to eliminate them entirely. By mid-1941, entire battalions had become chemically dependent, functioning, fighting, and breaking down on stimulant-driven cycles. In the trenches of the Eastern Front, addiction was no longer a side effect. It was a structural part of warfare. Soldiers fought not only against the Red Army, the climate, and their own exhaustion, but against the tightening grip of the pills that had once promised victory. What began as a tool for speed had become a chain that bound thousands. And as the front stretched deeper into the Soviet Union, the dark reality of stimulant dependence would soon collide with battles that demanded more endurance than any man chemically enhanced or not could sustain. As summer bled into autumn and the Wehrmacht pushed deeper into Soviet territory, the stimulant-fueled momentum that had carried German troops across Europe began to collide with a force far more relentless than any enemy battalion: the Russian climate. The vast distances, primitive roads, and early frost exposed limits that no pill could conceal. Pervitin could keep a man awake, alert, even aggressive, but it could not warm frozen hands, mend broken boots, or shield flesh from the killing cold. The first signs of strain appeared as temperatures dropped. Soldiers who had been marching for days under the stimulant's influence now found themselves fighting not just exhaustion, but the elemental brutality of the Russian landscape. In Belarusian forests and Ukrainian steppes, nights brought temperatures that seeped through overcoats and froze breath into the air. Men who relied on Pervitin to push through fatigue discovered that the drug increased their heart rate, but offered no protection against the creeping numbness spreading through fingers and toes. In fact, stimulants made the cold more dangerous. Pervitin masked the body's natural signals: the gradual slowing, the urge to stop and warm oneself, the instinct to conserve energy. Soldiers pushed forward long after their bodies began to shut down. Some marched with fingers turning white beneath their gloves, unaware frostbite had already begun. Others collapsed beside roads after hours of stimulant-driven exertion. their exhausted bodies unable to generate the heat needed to survive. Medical officers encountered cases that defied straightforward explanation. Young, otherwise healthy soldiers suffering severe frostbite after marches that should not have been lethal. Upon investigation, many were found to have taken multiple doses of Pervitin. The drug had allowed them to continue moving long after they should have stopped, long after their extremities had passed the point of no return. Fatigue became deadly as well. When the stimulant wore off, crashes struck with overwhelming force. Men fell asleep in snowdrifts, leaning against trees or lying beside their rifles. Those not found quickly risked freezing to death within minutes. Platoon leaders and medics patrolled trenches and bivouac sites at night, shaking awake soldiers who had succumbed to sudden sleep. Some never woke again. Stimulant use also intensified the psychological effects of the Russian campaign. Men, already strained by lack of sleep and the horrors of combat, now faced vast, empty distances that eroded sanity. The wind carried strange sounds through the forests. Snowstorms turned the world into a white, disorienting void. Soldiers spoke of hearing voices in the wind, seeing movement where none existed, or feeling watched from tree lines buried beneath drifts of ice. Reports of hallucinations increased sharply. In one unit near Vyazma, several soldiers insisted they had seen Soviet patrols stalking them through the blizzard, only for officers to discover there were no patrols in the area. Another squad fired into an empty tree line for nearly 2 minutes, convinced they were under attack. Fear and stimulant-induced paranoia merged into a fog that made night operations increasingly dangerous. At the same time, dependency worsened, with rest nearly impossible in the cold and the constant threat of Soviet counterattacks. Many soldiers relied on Pervitin simply to function. They swallowed tablets during pre-dawn marches, before defensive holds, and whenever exhaustion threatened to overwhelm them. The stimulant became both a crutch and a trap, helping them survive the moment, while deepening the long-term collapse already brewing inside their bodies. Commanders saw the symptoms, but were powerless to change the environment or the expectations. Orders from Berlin demanded continued advance. The front was stretched thin, supply lines strained to breaking, and winter equipment insufficient. Under such pressure, stimulant use became less a tactic than a necessity. Yet, even Pervitin had limits. As winter fully settled in, the drug's effects grew dangerously inconsistent. Some men became jittery and hyperactive, burning precious calories that their bodies could not replace. Others experienced sudden cardiac episodes. A few entered states of near hysteria, unable to distinguish between real threats and imagined ones. The harsh climate amplified every weakness created by addiction and exhaustion. The cold reality of Russia revealed an unavoidable truth. Human bodies could not be chemically forced to endure terrain and temperatures designed to break armies. Pervitin had fueled Germany's advance across Europe, but in the frozen fields outside Moscow, the drug met a force it could not conquer. The stimulant kept soldiers awake, but the Russian winter made sure they paid for every sleepless hour. And as the front stalled, the limits of chemically enhanced warfare became painfully, fatally clear. By the time the Wehrmacht reached the outskirts of Smolensk, a subtle but pervasive problem had begun to ripple through German units: the human cost of chemical endurance. Pervitin had allowed soldiers to march farther, fight longer, and remain alert under conditions that would have broken ordinary men. Yet as dependence grew and psychological strain intensified, commanders faced an uncomfortable reality. Entire units were beginning to fracture physically, mentally, and emotionally, but the military culture of obedience and the urgency of operations left little room for intervention. Many officers chose to look the other way. The logic was deceptively simple. The war demanded results. Troops who faltered could jeopardize entire operations. In the fast-moving campaigns of the East, delays could be fatal, costing ground, equipment, or lives. Commanders weighed the immediate benefit of stimulant use against its potential long-term consequences, and often concluded that speed, momentum, and battlefield effectiveness outweighed concerns about dependency or psychological breakdown. In practice, this meant that signs of overstimulation, hallucinations, and physical collapse were frequently ignored. Soldiers collapsed mid-march, trembling, sweating, or unresponsive, and were propped back onto their feet to continue. Field medics made quiet notes in their reports, but officers rarely acted, preferring to maintain forward motion. Units that exhibited erratic behavior were disciplined superficially, their mental and physical strain attributed to fatigue, poor morale, or lack of discipline, rather than the effects of sustained stimulant use. Some officers were aware of the deeper issue, but remained silent. Company and battalion leaders knew that men who relied heavily on Pervitin would falter without it. They witnessed crashes after long marches, breakdowns during defensive holds, and hallucinations during night operations. Yet the orders from above emphasized movement, attack, and the relentless push into Soviet territory. Reporting problems risked delay, reprimand, or worse, a perception of weakness in the command structure. In this environment, turning a blind eye became both a practical necessity and an unspoken policy. The consequences were immediate and tangible. Supply chains strained to provide enough stimulants to keep the pace, creating tension between frontline units and logistical officers. Soldiers dependent on the drug experienced heightened irritability, impaired judgment, and erratic behavior when doses were delayed or unavailable. In some cases, units were temporarily incapacitated when multiple men experienced simultaneous crashes, leaving gaps in the line or delaying assaults. Officers, recognizing the risk, continued distribution rather than curtailing it. Yet, this neglect was not purely negligence. From a strategic perspective, commanders were operating under extreme pressure. The Eastern Front was vast, enemy forces numerous, and terrain unforgiving. The promise of chemically sustained alertness allowed them to exploit speed in a way that ordinary human endurance could not. Pervitin was both a tool and a burden, a calculated risk whose immediate payoff often outweighed the potential cost. In letters and diaries, some soldiers recorded bitter resentment toward the officers who allowed them to push beyond limits. They spoke of being forced to continue despite trembling, blurred vision, or sheer exhaustion. A few recalled moments when they knew the drug was the only thing keeping them moving, and yet there was no reprieve. Commanders, consciously or not, had normalized the use of stimulants as a structural part of war, prioritizing operational tempo over the human body. The long-term consequences would prove profound. Entire divisions became dependent on chemical stimulation for survival, eroding trust in natural endurance and creating a fragile, overstretched fighting force. Officers who looked the other way contributed to a culture where momentum was valued above health and speed above sustainability. In the eyes of the High Command, the approach succeeded. German troops advanced faster than any opponent expected. But the invisible debt of dependency, strain, and psychological instability was mounting silently, awaiting the day when even Pervitin would no longer be enough to sustain the war machine. As the Wehrmacht's campaigns stretched farther into the Soviet Union, an unexpected vulnerability emerged. The relentless demand for Pervitin strained the army's logistical networks to a breaking point. What had begun as a supplement to endurance now shaped the rhythm of operations. Soldiers relied on stimulants to march, fight, and survive. Commanders counted on them to maintain the pace of Blitzkrieg. And when supply lines faltered, the consequences were immediate, tangible, and often catastrophic. The challenge was deceptively simple: moving enough tablets from factories in Germany to the sprawling front lines across thousands of kilometers of roads, rivers, and railways. Early in the war, production had kept pace with deployment in Poland and France. Factories, such as WWII, had expanded output, and distribution networks were designed to deliver doses alongside ammunition, rations, and medical supplies. But the Eastern Front presented a scale that no pre-war plan could accommodate. Distances were vast. Railroads were under constant threat. Trucks carrying stimulants, fuel, and food jostled along roads that alternated between mud, ice, and dust, depending on the season. Shortages began to appear as soon as units moved beyond the reach of established depots. Some battalions received only partial allocations of Pervitin during forced marches that required continuous wakefulness. Medics improvised, rationing tablets to maintain minimal operational effectiveness. Officers instructed soldiers to stretch their doses, taking smaller amounts at intervals, but the strategy was imperfect. Human endurance, artificially sustained for weeks, could not simply be recalibrated to fewer pills without consequences. The effects were swift. Soldiers accustomed to stimulant-enhanced alertness found themselves collapsing during marches, nodding off at checkpoints, or performing tasks sluggishly. Units fell behind schedule, leaving gaps between columns that exposed them to reconnaissance and counterattack. In one documented case, an infantry company near Smolensk paused mid-march because its soldiers could no longer function at the expected tempo, forcing accompanying artillery units to halt and disrupting an entire operational timetable. Morale suffered alongside performance. Troops dependent on stimulants for focus and motivation became anxious when rations ran low. Soldiers whispered about their dwindling supply, worried they would falter before reaching rest points. Some attempted to barter tablets among themselves, creating tension within squads. Others hoarded what they had, leading to confrontations and disciplinary incidents. Medics reported rising incidents of agitation, nausea, and jitteriness, classic withdrawal symptoms amplified by exhaustion. Commanders faced a difficult choice. Pushing forward risked exposing overstimulated, undersupplied units to collapse. Delaying operations sacrificed momentum, the very element that had defined early Blitzkrieg success. Many chose the former, distributing what little Pervitin they had while expecting their men to perform at previous levels. The tension between chemical dependency and operational demand became a defining feature of the campaign. The shortages also revealed systemic weaknesses. Supply depots, previously reliable, were vulnerable to enemy action, mechanical failure, and weather. The demand for Pervitin was never static. As the army advanced farther east, consumption outpaced production. Factories struggled to increase output while maintaining quality. Errors in packaging, transportation delays, and misallocated shipments became routine. The stimulant, once an asset, now risked becoming a liability. By winter, the problem escalated. Soldiers marched through cold, snow, and ice, reliant on dwindling Pervitin reserves. Medics and officers alike recognized that the army's pace, once artificially enhanced by chemistry, could not be sustained indefinitely. The stimulant had enabled extraordinary movement, but the supply shortages exposed the fragility of a system built on human dependency and chemical intervention. The lessons were stark. An army that relied on stimulants was only as strong as its supply lines. When Pervitin ran low, even the most disciplined, well-trained soldiers were vulnerable. And on the Eastern Front, vulnerability was often fatal. By the winter of 1941, the prolonged campaigns on the Eastern Front had begun to exact a toll far more insidious than the battlefield's immediate dangers. Soldiers who had survived Poland, France, and the initial advances into Soviet territory were beginning to show the effects of repeated stimulant use, prolonged exertion, and continuous exposure to extreme stress. Veterans, who once performed with near-mechanical efficiency, now displayed signs of mental collapse, a consequence of months, even years, of chemically extended endurance. Medical officers in field hospitals and rear area facilities began documenting unusual psychological cases. Men who had previously been reliable, disciplined, and resilient were now arriving in a dazed, jittery state. Some exhibited heightened irritability, reacting violently to minor provocations. Others became withdrawn, refusing orders, muttering to themselves, or staring blankly into space for hours. These breakdowns often coincided with withdrawal from Pervitin, as the stimulant's temporary suppression of fatigue, anxiety, and stress ended abruptly. In frontline units, these mental breakdowns were equally apparent. Commanders noted soldiers who, after weeks of forced marches and constant engagement, suddenly faltered in combat, making errors that jeopardized their units. Observers described men hesitating to fire their weapons, misjudging distances, or failing to follow basic tactical instructions. These were veterans who had survived prior campaigns unscathed, yet now the cumulative strain of chemical dependence and combat exposure undermined their effectiveness. The symptoms were diverse but consistent. Trembling hands, erratic heart rates, insomnia, and vivid hallucinations became common among seasoned soldiers. Some experienced paranoia, believing that comrades were betraying them or that enemy forces were present where none existed. Others suffered sudden depressive episodes, feeling overwhelming despair in moments when operational demands required clarity. Medics, overwhelmed by volume and severity, struggled to differentiate between combat-induced stress, stimulant withdrawal, and genuine psychological illness. Officers faced a moral and operational dilemma. They were aware that the stimulants which had enabled speed, vigilance, and aggressive action were also contributing to these breakdowns. Yet, the campaigns demanded continued momentum. Units could not pause for psychological recovery, and the Army's doctrine prioritized speed and shock over the health of individual soldiers. Commanders often made the pragmatic choice to keep overstimulated veterans in the field, rationing Pervitin to maintain their performance while masking the signs of breakdown from higher command. Letters and diaries from the front provide a glimpse into the human cost. Veterans wrote of nights filled with nightmares, of hallucinations that refused to fade, of moments when they felt their minds unmoored from their bodies. Some described a creeping sense of unreality, as if time itself had been chemically stretched and the body could no longer keep pace with the mind. Many expressed fear, shame, or guilt emotions intensified by the expectation of stoicism and the stigma surrounding mental health in the Wehrmacht. The breakdown of veterans highlighted a broader structural issue. Prolonged stimulant use created a force that could perform at extraordinary levels for short periods, but left its most experienced soldiers increasingly fragile. The same men who had carried the army through lightning campaigns were now vulnerable to collapse, both individually and collectively. Their expertise, honed through combat and survival, became compromised not by enemy fire, but by the very measures that had amplified their initial effectiveness. By the time winter tightened its grip on the Eastern Front, the cumulative psychological damage was impossible to ignore. Veterans were breaking down in greater numbers, units were becoming unpredictable, and the human cost of chemical endurance had moved from anecdote to systemic crisis. The stimulant that had propelled Germany's early victories was now revealing its hidden, devastating consequences, a truth that would shape the fortunes of the Wehrmacht in the months and years to come. As the Wehrmacht pushed deeper into Soviet territory, the operational tempo fueled by Pervitin began to produce effects beyond exhaustion and mental strain effects that would ripple into the darkest corners of human behavior. Soldiers under the influence of stimulants exhibited heightened aggression, reduced inhibition, and an impaired capacity for judgment. While stimulants had initially been celebrated for extending endurance and alertness, their psychological consequences quietly began to manifest in ways that contributed to brutal and sometimes unlawful actions on the Eastern Front. Reports from field officers and medical personnel noted unusual incidents, men striking comrades over minor disagreements, shooting indiscriminately at perceived threats, and exhibiting emotional volatility during engagements with civilians. These behaviors were not universal, but they were frequent enough to raise concern among observers. Pervitin increased energy and aggression, but it also reduced the soldiers' ability to process moral and ethical boundaries. Decisions that would have been tempered by caution or empathy became impulsive, reactive, and in some cases violent. The first documented cases involved local populations. In occupied villages, overstimulated soldiers sometimes reacted with disproportionate force to minor infractions, perceived resistance, or even misinterpretations of civilian behavior. Anecdotal accounts describe men firing into empty fields, destroying property unnecessarily, and engaging in punitive actions that lacked operational justification. In several instances, these actions escalated into war crimes, as overstimulated troops acted impulsively, guided more by chemical-fueled aggression than strategic necessity. The combination of fatigue, stimulants, and the ideological indoctrination of the German military created a particularly dangerous environment. Pervitin enhanced alertness and diminished the natural inhibitory responses that might prevent a soldier from acting violently against unarmed civilians. Coupled with long periods without sleep, prolonged exposure to combat stress, and the dehumanizing narratives of Nazi propaganda, the stimulant contributed to a psychological state where moral constraints weakened and aggressive behavior intensified. Medical officers noted physiological and psychological patterns that correlated with these behaviors. Soldiers who had taken multiple doses over days displayed heightened heart rates, tremors, and increased irritability. They became impulsive, responding instantly to perceived threats without deliberation. In some cases, hallucinations blurred the line between reality and threat, leading to extreme defensive or offensive responses. Commanders recognized the behavioral anomalies, but often dismissed them as the unavoidable consequences of war, prioritizing operational effectiveness over individual regulation. The influence of stimulants also affected command decisions indirectly. Officers accustomed to chemically enhanced soldiers expected high performance and unrelenting momentum. When soldiers faltered or acted unpredictably, the response was often punitive, escalating tension and fostering a climate where moral judgment was secondary to obedience and speed. Over time, this created systemic conditions that allowed, and in some cases encouraged, acts that violated the laws of war. Historians have noted that while Pervitin did not directly cause war crimes, it was a contributing factor in a chain of human, environmental, and ideological pressures that led to excessive violence. The stimulant amplified aggression, suppressed caution, and blurred the mental boundaries that separate lawful combat from criminal action. In the chaos of the Eastern Front, where split-second decisions were critical, Pervitin-fueled soldiers often found themselves acting on impulses that would later be judged morally and legally indefensible. By the end of 1941, it was clear that chemical endurance had a dark side. Pervitin extended human performance, but it also amplified the capacity for violence, a hidden consequence that would leave a lasting imprint on both the soldiers who consumed it and the civilians caught in the path of Germany's rapid advance. The drug, intended to sustain the army, had quietly shaped the battlefield in ways far beyond tactics, strategy, or logistics. While German troops relied increasingly on Pervitin to maintain their momentum on the front lines, a quieter, less visible crisis was emerging back home. The same stimulant that fueled Blitzkrieg in Europe had seeped into civilian life, creating patterns of dependence that mirrored in miniature those developing within the army. Factories, offices, and even households became conduits for stimulant use, and the very society sustaining Germany's war machine was beginning to experience the effects of widespread chemical reliance. Werke and other pharmaceutical manufacturers had scaled production to meet military demand, but not exclusively. Civilians continued to receive Pervitin from pharmacies, often marketed under the guise of productivity, alertness, and general well-being. Advertisements promised sharper focus, longer working hours, and improved performance, a subtle echo of the wartime propaganda glorifying efficiency. Workers on assembly lines, clerks in office buildings, and students studying long into the night found themselves experimenting with the same tablets that sustained soldiers hundreds of miles away. In urban centers such as Berlin, Hamburg, and Munich, reports began to accumulate. Workers admitted to taking daily doses to meet the relentless pace of industrial production. Some consumed tablets in the morning to shake off the fog of early hours, others at midday to maintain concentration, and a few in the evening to finish overtime assignments. For many, Pervitin became inseparable from daily functioning. The tablet was not a supplement, but a requirement to perform the tasks demanded by employers and society alike. Medical practitioners started noticing the consequences. Patients presented with tremors, insomnia, anxiety, and heart palpitations, symptoms remarkably similar to those emerging among soldiers on the front. Some individuals exhibited erratic behavior or sudden emotional volatility, raising concerns about both physical and psychological well-being. Withdrawal from the drug was equally pronounced. Workers who missed doses reported fatigue so extreme that even routine tasks became impossible. Absenteeism, once an occasional inconvenience, rose dramatically in factories and offices where Pervitin had become a tacitly required aid. The social consequences were subtle but profound. Families reported tension as members depended on stimulants to fulfill obligations that previously would have been managed without chemical intervention. Parents who took tablets to maintain household routines sometimes became irritable or detached, their attention fragmented despite outward productivity. Children observed adults performing tasks mechanically, awake and energetic but emotionally strained, sowing a quiet unease in homes already shadowed by the anxieties of war. Authorities were aware of the phenomenon but largely indifferent. National focus remained on military operations, and civilian dependence was framed as a minor issue, easily justified by the demands of wartime production. In offices and factories, managers implicitly encouraged stimulant use, rewarding those who maintained high output and ignoring the growing pattern of chemical reliance. Pervitin, like rationed goods or work quotas, became part of the infrastructure of a society mobilized for war. The pattern resembled what was happening in the Wehrmacht. Dependence was not accidental, but systemic. Chemical stimulation had become normalized, and individuals adapted their lives around it. Withdrawal, crashes, and mental strain were tolerated as incidental to the larger goal: productivity, efficiency, and victory. Yet the long-term consequences were starting to accumulate in quiet, often invisible ways. Heart problems, mental fatigue, and emotional instability began affecting the very citizens who sustained Germany's industrial and logistical base. By the end of 1941, the stimulant had created a dual crisis. On the front lines, soldiers were chemically dependent to maintain momentum. At home, civilians relied on the same drug to meet the demands of a nation at war. The consequences of this widespread use would linger long after the initial campaigns, exposing a society and a military that had become inseparable from a chemical lifeline. Pervitin had transcended its original role as medicine, becoming both a tool and a trap, a force shaping human behavior in ways the architects of its distribution had barely anticipated. By late 1941, a quiet alarm had begun to circulate within the German medical community. Pervitin, the stimulant that had fueled the early triumphs of the Wehrmacht, was leaving a trail of physiological and psychological damage that could no longer be ignored. Field doctors, hospital physicians, and research chemists documented cases of tremors, cardiovascular strain, insomnia, hallucinations, and severe psychological instability. Yet despite mounting evidence, the warnings arrived too late to prevent the entrenched dependence on stimulants that had become central to Germany's operational doctrine. The first reports emerged from forward field hospitals on the Eastern Front. Medics observed soldiers who collapsed during marches, their bodies betraying the chemical suspension of exhaustion that had carried them across vast distances. They noted rapid heart rates, muscle tremors, and anxiety symptoms that were acute and recurrent. More subtle, yet equally alarming, were the psychological manifestations. Hallucinations during night operations, paranoia in secure positions, sudden aggression toward comrades, and deep depressions following extended stimulant use. In units that had relied on Pervitin for weeks or months, these cases were not rare anomalies, they were becoming systemic. Laboratory studies conducted behind the front lines corroborated these observations. Chemists and physicians found that repeated methamphetamine exposure altered neurological function, disrupted sleep patterns, and increased the risk of cardiac events. Withdrawal symptoms were pronounced and dangerous, ranging from intense fatigue to emotional instability, and in some cases, suicidal ideation. The drug, originally intended to enhance performance temporarily, was revealing the cumulative toll on the human body and mind. Despite these findings, the warnings faced institutional inertia. Commanders at both divisional and higher levels were reluctant to slow operations or reduce stimulant distribution, prioritizing tactical momentum over human health. The early successes in Poland, France, and the initial advances in the Soviet Union had created an expectation. The Wehrmacht must maintain speed and operational intensity at all costs. Reports from medical officers were often filed, noted, and quietly shelved. The operational imperative drowned out cautionary voices. Even at the highest levels of the military medical bureaucracy, concerns were treated as subordinate to strategy. Some physicians advocated for rationing the drug, adjusting dosage schedules, or providing rest periods to mitigate harm. Others called for research into safer alternatives or better monitoring of consumption. Yet logistical realities and operational pressures rendered such interventions nearly impossible. Divisions were advancing faster than resupply chains could keep up, and commanders refused to compromise momentum for concerns that were largely invisible on the battlefield. The warnings that did reach the high command were often sanitized. Reports emphasized isolated incidents rather than systemic trends. Casualty figures included deaths from exhaustion or exposure, but rarely attributed them explicitly to stimulant misuse. Internal memos acknowledged hallucinations or psychological instability, but framed them as expected results of combat stress, not chemically induced phenomena. By the time the magnitude of the problem was understood, the army was already entrenched in sustained campaigns across harsh terrain, where stimulant dependence had become an operational norm. The consequences of inaction were becoming evident. Entire units were suffering from cumulative physiological and mental strain. Soldiers relied on stimulants to march, fight, and function, creating a cycle of dependence that commanders could not interrupt without slowing operations. The very tool that had enabled early victories had become a liability, undermining long-term effectiveness and introducing unpredictability into planning. The medical warnings came too late to alter the course of early operations. Pervitin had already shaped the structure, tempo, and expectations of the Wehrmacht. Its effects, both empowering and destructive, were embedded in the army's performance. What began as a chemical advantage had transformed into a source of vulnerability, leaving soldiers, commanders, and the military machine itself to contend with the hidden costs of artificially extended human endurance. The message was clear. In war, the delay of caution can be as deadly as the enemy. By the time the scale of harm was recognized, it was no longer preventable, only managed, patched over, and endured. As the Wehrmacht pressed deeper into Soviet territory during the bitter winter of 1941, the once unseen consequences of stimulant reliance began to erupt into chaos. Soldiers who had long depended on Pervitin for extended wakefulness, enhanced focus, and artificial stamina now faced its absence or abrupt reduction, and the results were immediate, destabilizing, and often dangerous. Withdrawal, largely ignored or underestimated in planning, revealed the fragile underbelly of an army conditioned to operate far beyond natural limits. In the trenches and makeshift encampments, medics documented a rising tide of symptoms. Soldiers who had relied on daily doses of Pervitin exhibited acute fatigue, tremors, and headaches. Insomnia, previously suppressed by chemical stimulation, returned with a vengeance. Some men were incapable of maintaining their usual operational pace, collapsing mid-march, nodding off in positions of relative safety, or losing coordination during routine tasks. What had been temporarily deferred by stimulant use now arrived simultaneously across entire units, producing systemic disruptions that officers struggled to manage. Psychological effects were equally severe. Withdrawal exacerbated anxiety, irritability, and emotional instability. Soldiers who had been calm under stress became unpredictable, prone to sudden outbursts or panic reactions. Hallucinations, which had been intermittent, became more vivid. Men reported seeing enemies in empty fields, hearing phantom orders, or believing themselves surrounded when no threat existed. In several cases, Soldiers fired their weapons indiscriminately, creating dangers not from the enemy, but from their own overstimulated and chemically destabilized comrades. These individual crises quickly escalated into operational problems. Units accustomed to continuous, chemically enhanced momentum found themselves unable to meet expected timelines. Columns slowed, reconnaissance patrols lagged, and gaps appeared in defensive lines. Commanders, unaware or unwilling to fully acknowledge the extent of stimulant dependence, interpreted these failures as poor discipline or inadequate training, rather than physiological withdrawal. Attempts to enforce pace often intensified stress, pushing already vulnerable soldiers closer to collapse. The chaos was compounded by logistical challenges. Pervitin supplies, already strained by the vast distances and fragile rail networks of the Eastern Front, could not meet the renewed demand. Soldiers desperate for relief scavenged remaining tablets, sometimes taking doses far above recommended levels in an attempt to stave off withdrawal. The resulting overstimulation worsened symptoms once the drug finally wore off, creating a vicious cycle of dependence, crash, and erratic behavior. Even officers and medics were affected. Many had taken Pervitin themselves to maintain long hours of planning, coordination, and supervision. As their own tolerance ebbed, they experienced fatigue and irritability, diminishing their capacity to manage troops and respond to emergencies. Command structures, once precise and efficient, began to show cracks. Decisions that required judgment were made under conditions of chemical and psychological stress, leading to errors in timing, coordination, and troop deployment. The cumulative effect was unmistakable. Withdrawal from Pervitin transformed units from highly coordinated instruments of Blitzkrieg into unpredictable collections of exhausted, chemically dependent individuals. Successes achieved through speed and aggression became difficult to replicate, while the mental and physical fragility of troops posed risks not only to themselves, but to the Army's overall operational integrity. By the end of 1941, the withdrawal crisis had illuminated a harsh truth. The chemical advantage that had propelled the Wehrmacht's early victories carried consequences that could no longer be ignored. Artificially extended endurance came at the cost of stability, predictability, and human resilience. Soldiers who had once marched tirelessly, fought relentlessly, and maneuvered with mechanical precision now revealed the price of dependency: chaos, collapse, and a vulnerability that no training or doctrine could fully mitigate. The stimulant had given Germany speed. Withdrawal now revealed its hidden danger, an army at the mercy of the very chemistry that had once carried it forward. As the Wehrmacht advanced deeper into Soviet territory, the tension between military discipline and chemical dependence began to shape the daily reality of soldiers and officers alike. For years, the German army had relied on Pervitin to sustain momentum, prolong wakefulness, and suppress the natural fatigue that accompanies combat and forced marches. But by late 1941, the line between disciplined obedience and chemical compulsion was no longer theoretical, it was a battlefield fact. Commanders faced a paradox. On paper, German doctrine emphasized strict discipline, precise execution of orders, and adherence to tactical plans. Soldiers were trained to follow commands without hesitation, maintaining formation, executing maneuvers, and sustaining pace under stress. Yet in practice, the effectiveness of these units increasingly depended on the stimulant that had become embedded in operational culture. Men could march, fight, and stay awake not purely because of training or personal resolve, but because their nervous systems were artificially stimulated. Officers were acutely aware of the consequences. Field reports began noting units that performed flawlessly while under the influence of Pervitin but became erratic the moment supplies ran low. Soldiers who had been tireless during forced marches suddenly lagged behind. Combat efficiency dropped and coordination faltered. Commanders recognized the pattern but were constrained by both ideology and necessity. Discipline demanded continued performance. Dependence demanded continued stimulation. In most cases, the solution was to issue more tablets rather than enforce rest. The resulting tension permeated the ranks. Some officers attempted to enforce limits on stimulant use, worried about long-term health and reliability. They instructed medics to monitor dosage, restrict excessive consumption, or schedule rest periods. In theory, these measures aimed to balance endurance with sustainability. In practice, the demands of the Eastern Front made them nearly impossible. Troops were expected to move at unnatural speed, often across hundreds of kilometers, through forests, rivers, and snow. The chemical edge became inseparable from operational survival. Soldiers themselves were caught in a similar bind. Dependency created both a perceived necessity and an internalized expectation. Men accustomed to functioning on Pervitin often felt incapable of performing without it. Withdrawal symptoms, fatigue, irritability, tremors, and disorientation emerged whenever tablets were unavailable, leaving soldiers physically impaired and psychologically anxious. Some attempted to ration their own consumption, but doing so meant falling behind or being perceived as weak by peers and superiors. Discipline, in the strict military sense, became inseparable from chemical support. The phenomenon extended beyond the front line. Medics and support personnel, responsible for distribution and monitoring, also relied on the stimulant to manage long hours and grueling tasks. Officers at battalion and divisional levels found their judgment sharpened yet distorted by repeated doses. The very structures designed to enforce discipline now operated in a feedback loop, dependent on the chemical edge they were meant to supervise. The conflict between discipline and dependence had operational consequences. Units experiencing stimulant shortages became unpredictable. Orders were executed inconsistently. Soldiers crashed mid-march, failed to respond to commands, or engaged in impulsive actions that jeopardized cohesion. Commanders were forced to adapt in real time, improvising schedules and redistributing limited tablets to maintain functionality. By the winter of 1941, it was evident that the Wehrmacht's discipline, once the cornerstone of military efficiency, had become intertwined with chemical dependency. The stimulant that had extended endurance, sharpened focus, and accelerated campaigns now imposed its own rules. Units performed best when supplied and faltered when deprived. In effect, the army had become dependent not only on obedience, but on the very substance that blurred the line between human capability and chemical coercion. Discipline and dependence existed in uneasy equilibrium, a delicate balance that would increasingly shape both the strategy and the suffering of Germany's military as the war dragged on. By the winter of 1941, the cumulative effects of stimulant dependence, extreme fatigue, and relentless combat pressure began to erode the morale of the Wehrmacht in ways that were both visible and insidious. Early victories, celebrated in propaganda as proof of German superiority and the efficiency of Blitzkrieg, had masked a deeper problem: the human cost of continuous chemical enhancement. Pervitin had sustained performance, extended wakefulness, and delayed exhaustion, but it had also created a fragile psychological ecosystem within the army, one where confidence, cohesion, and motivation became tightly bound to chemical intake. Morale, once a reflection of training, discipline, and belief in command, began to falter under the weight of overstimulation and withdrawal. Soldiers who had marched for days with little sleep, relying on stimulants to maintain awareness, were now experiencing crashes that made even simple orders difficult to execute. Entire units became tense, irritable, and prone to arguments or insubordination. Officers reported instances of bickering over trivial matters, mutinous whispers, and sudden emotional withdrawal among men who had previously demonstrated exemplary cohesion. The effects of Pervitin on morale were paradoxical. On one hand, it enabled soldiers to maintain focus and fight aggressively in combat, creating a sense of invincibility. On the other hand, once the chemical effects waned, the same men experienced profound vulnerability. Confidence could turn quickly into despair, focus into anxiety, and aggression into exhaustion-induced irritability. Medics observed that soldiers in withdrawal often felt useless, incapable, or anxious emotions amplified by the harsh environment, insufficient food, and brutal weather. The Eastern Front amplified these vulnerabilities. Soldiers confronted endless distances, muddy or frozen terrain, and bitter cold, often without adequate shelter or clothing. The snow and ice became a physical and psychological enemy, magnifying the effects of stimulant dependence. Men who had marched with unnatural energy through summer campaigns now trudged through deep snow, their limbs stiff and their minds racing against fatigue. Even minor injuries, frostbite, or equipment failures took on a disproportionate weight, undermining confidence and heightening frustration. Commanders struggled to maintain morale in the face of these chemical and environmental pressures. Reports reached divisional headquarters of units refusing orders, lagging behind during forced marches, or showing visible signs of panic during minor enemy encounters. Some officers attempted to enforce discipline strictly, believing that adherence to orders would override chemical withdrawal and fatigue. Others tried to supplement rations or allow brief rest periods, but operational demands often overrode these interventions. The balance between maintaining offensive momentum and supporting human endurance became increasingly precarious. Hallucinations and paranoia side effects of prolonged stimulant use further destabilized morale. Soldiers reported seeing threats where none existed, hearing phantom orders, or imagining attacks that never occurred. These psychological distortions eroded trust between comrades and officers, introducing fear and confusion into units that previously relied on cohesion. Even brief lapses in morale could cascade into operational inefficiency, creating delays, miscommunication, and exposure to genuine danger. The collapse of morale was subtle at first, then increasingly systemic. Chemical dependence had created soldiers capable of extraordinary feats, but also men whose confidence, stability, and judgment were tenuous. Pervitin had allowed the army to achieve early victories, but it had also tethered success to the precarious state of human psychology under chemical enhancement. By the end of 1941, the signs were unmistakable. Morale was no longer simply a function of leadership or victory. It had become a reflection of chemical stability. The stimulant that had driven the Wehrmacht's early successes had simultaneously undermined the very human foundation upon which its operations depended. Soldiers could still fight, march, and obey, but the internal cohesion and resilience that once defined the German army were fraying a hidden crisis that no victory could mask. By the end of 1941, the chemical and psychological strain on the Wehrmacht had escalated to a level that tested even the most disciplined officers. Pervitin had enabled astonishing operational tempo, giving soldiers the ability to march, fight, and maneuver far beyond normal human limits. Yet the very stimulant that had created these advantages also eroded the foundations of command: trust, cohesion, and predictability. Officers found themselves managing not only the external pressures of the Eastern Front, but the internal volatility of men whose endurance had been artificially extended. Field reports increasingly noted erratic behavior among troops. Soldiers who had performed flawlessly under chemical stimulation now displayed aggression, confusion, or apathy during withdrawal periods. Entire squads were prone to muttering, disputes, or passive resistance when stimulant rations ran low. Officers were forced to interpret these behaviors while maintaining the illusion of normal discipline. The challenge was immense. Pervitin had created soldiers who were both more capable and more unpredictable, and commanders had little guidance on how to balance operational demands with human fragility. At the platoon and company level, leaders devised strategies to maintain order. Rationing tablets, staggering duties, and alternating periods of high-intensity activity with minimal rest became standard practice. Officers attempted to time stimulant distribution to coincide with expected operational peaks, a forced synchronization of chemical effects with tactical needs. Even so, unpredictability remained. Soldiers crashed mid-march, fell asleep in positions of responsibility, or became reactive to trivial provocations. In several cases, subordinate leaders were forced to physically restrain men who threatened to disrupt formation or endanger comrades. commanders were also acutely aware of the long-term consequences. Veteran soldiers, seasoned through multiple campaigns, were now exhibiting signs of psychological breakdown and physical deterioration. Officers worried about the cumulative toll on experienced units. Men who had been reliable in Poland and France were now vulnerable to collapse under chemical strain. Leadership had to compensate for the uneven reliability of troops, sometimes making tactical decisions with partial units or underestimating operational fatigue. The strain on officers themselves was considerable. Many relied on stimulants to maintain their own alertness, extending work hours far beyond normal endurance. Planning, coordination, and supervision required sustained cognitive function, yet officers, like their men, were vulnerable to stimulant-induced crashes and withdrawal. Command structures became fragile not because of insubordination alone, but because both leaders and subordinates shared the same dependency. The chemical enhancement that had once amplified human capability now blurred the line between command authority and physiological necessity. Incidents of breakdown forced improvisation. Units that experienced sudden collapses were reorganized on the spot. Orders were simplified. High-risk maneuvers were postponed or delegated to units with sufficient stimulant supplies. Officers were left to weigh the operational necessity of continued aggression against the reality that exhausted, chemically dependent soldiers could not reliably execute plans. The margin for error shrank as the army advanced into more hostile terrain. The challenge was compounded by morale. Soldiers who recognized their own dependence often experienced anxiety, irritability, and frustration, which, in turn, affected cohesion and obedience. Officers attempting to enforce discipline had to navigate both chemical-induced volatility and the resentment of men who felt powerless against their own physiological needs. Traditional methods of command, drills, threats, and rewards proved insufficient when the human body was operating outside its natural limits. By late 1941, the Wehrmacht had achieved victories of unprecedented speed, but these triumphs came at the expense of command stability. Officers were no longer managing soldiers solely through training and hierarchy. They were contending with the chemical, psychological, and physiological effects of stimulant dependence. Maintaining control required constant vigilance, improvisation, and a tacit acknowledgement that operational success was inseparable from the pills that enabled it. The very tool that had extended human capability now dictated the limits of authority, forcing officers to navigate an army that was, in many ways, no longer fully human in its reliability. By the latter half of 1941, the Wehrmacht had achieved unprecedented operational momentum, moving swiftly across Europe and deep into Soviet territory. On paper, the German army appeared unstoppable. Victories came rapidly. Territory was seized in weeks rather than months, and reports praised efficiency, coordination, and aggressiveness. Yet behind these accounts, a subtle but dangerous erosion was underway. The High Command's control over its forces was weakening, a consequence of systemic reliance on chemical stimulants and the unpredictable human behavior they induced. Pervitin, once a tactical enhancement, had become a structural necessity. Operations were planned with the implicit assumption that soldiers would remain chemically stimulated for extended periods. Supply lines, timing schedules, and strategic objectives all hinged on the artificial extension of endurance. The drug had allowed commanders to compress time, to force troops to move faster than human limits would naturally allow. But this dependency created a hidden fragility. If stimulant supplies were disrupted, mismanaged, or misused, the very operations that depended on continuous momentum became vulnerable. Reports from the front began to reflect this tension. Units that had relied on regular Pervitin doses began to falter when supplies were delayed or exhausted. Infantry columns slowed unpredictably, artillery coordination lagged, and reconnaissance patrols returned late or disoriented. Commanders, used to troops performing beyond ordinary endurance, struggled to adapt. Orders that had previously been executed with precision were now followed inconsistently, and the illusion of control so critical to the High Command's strategic planning began to slip. The psychological impact on officers was profound. Many relied on Pervitin themselves to manage long hours, oversee multiple units, and maintain situational awareness across vast operational zones. Yet these same officers were subject to crashes, jitteriness, and impaired judgment when doses wore off or were unevenly distributed. Decisions were made under chemically influenced conditions, further complicating the chain of command. Errors in judgment, delayed reactions, and miscommunication increasingly arose not from incompetence, but from the physiological realities imposed by prolonged stimulant use. Morale, too, played a role. Soldiers who recognized their dependence on Pervitin experienced anxiety and frustration, particularly when distribution became inconsistent. Units became tense, cohesion weakened, and minor disputes escalated. Officers faced mounting challenges in maintaining authority, as men struggled with the twin pressures of chemical need and physical exhaustion. Orders could no longer be assumed to produce predictable results. The human element, once disciplined and reliable, was now erratic and chemically moderated. Even strategic planning at the highest level faced strain. Operational assumptions about troop endurance, speed of advance, and effectiveness during night operations were based on prior experiences under stimulant use. Yet, as the army stretched further into hostile territory, with longer supply lines and harsher environmental conditions, the reliability of chemically sustained performance became uncertain. Reports of crashes, hallucinations, and disorientation arrived too sporadically to allow accurate assessment, leaving the High Command to rely on projections that increasingly diverged from reality. By late 1941, the High Command's grip was slipping not because of battlefield defeat, but because of the artificial nature of its army's endurance. The stimulant that had enabled early victories also undermined predictability, obedience, and reliability. Units could still advance, fight, and maneuver, but only while chemical support was maintained. Any disruption, miscalculation, or shortage risked exposing the structural vulnerability hidden beneath the Wehrmacht's rapid successes. The speed, aggression, and coordination that had defined early Blitzkrieg campaigns were now a double-edged sword. Chemical dependence had extended human limits, but in doing so, it had weakened the very control necessary to sustain those limits. The High Command had created an army that could outrun exhaustion, yet it could no longer fully command it. The illusion of invincibility was becoming increasingly tenuous, revealing a critical truth. Reliance on Pervitin had amplified capability, but it had also sown the seeds of operational instability that could no longer be ignored. By the end of 1941, the cumulative effects of stimulant use across the Wehrmacht could no longer be ignored. Field hospitals, medical units, and logistical reports began to paint a stark picture. The same Pervitin that had propelled lightning advances across Europe had exacted a heavy toll on the soldiers' bodies and minds. While early victories were celebrated, behind the scenes, the human cost was mounting, measurable in fatigue, injury, psychological breakdown, and dependency. Medical officers compiled case reports that revealed a troubling trend. A significant portion of frontline soldiers exhibited symptoms consistent with prolonged stimulant use: chronic insomnia, tremors, accelerated heart rates, and extreme fatigue. Soldiers who had once marched with mechanical precision now collapsed during forced marches or mid-combat. Instances of frostbite, dehydration, and minor injuries became exacerbated by stimulant-induced overexertion, transforming otherwise survivable conditions into life-threatening events. Field hospitals reported that men previously deemed fully fit now required extended recovery periods. The psychological dimension of the human cost was equally striking. Withdrawal from stimulants produced severe irritability, anxiety, and depressive episodes. Soldiers admitted to hallucinations, paranoia, and sudden emotional swings. Some became prone to aggression or hypervigilance, while others fell into complete lethargy, unable to perform even basic tasks. Medics documented these cases meticulously, often noting the correlation between dosage schedules and the onset of psychological instability. Entire units showed patterns of erratic behavior when stimulant distribution faltered, a clear sign that operational effectiveness had become chemically dependent. Casualty statistics, when analyzed, revealed patterns rarely acknowledged in official reports. Soldiers suffering crashes from Pervitin depletion were not always categorized separately. Many were folded into broader categories of fatigue-related casualties or non-combat injuries. Yet anecdotal evidence and field observations suggested that these incidents were widespread. Infantry companies reported men incapacitated not by enemy fire, but by the combined effects of exhaustion and stimulant withdrawal. Tank crews experienced similar vulnerabilities. Drivers fell asleep at the wheel, gunners misjudged targeting, and navigators lost spatial orientation, all consequences of over-reliance on chemical endurance. The numbers were not limited to the front lines. Civilian reliance on stimulants mirrored military patterns. Factory workers, clerks, and students who took Pervitin to meet wartime production quotas began showing fatigue, emotional instability, and dependency. Hospitals in Berlin, Hamburg, and Munich documented rising cases of cardiovascular strain, tremors, and insomnia, highlighting the pervasive reach of stimulant use across society. The workforce, essential to sustaining the war machine, was quietly deteriorating in physical and psychological terms. Commanders attempted to quantify the impact on operational capacity. Reports highlighted a growing gap between theoretical troop endurance and actual performance. Units that had achieved extraordinary feats during early campaigns now required longer rest periods and medical intervention. Missions were delayed due to simultaneous crashes or withdrawal episodes. Supply officers, already stretched thin, struggled to maintain adequate stimulant rations, exacerbating both human and logistical vulnerability. By late 1941, the Wehrmacht faced an uncomfortable reality. The human cost of chemical enhancement was measurable, systemic, and increasing. Pervitin had enabled rapid victories, prolonged operations, and seemingly tireless soldiers, but it had also generated fatigue, dependency, psychological instability, and heightened vulnerability. The cost, once hidden beneath operational success, was now emerging in numbers, reports, and field observations that could no longer be ignored. The war machine had been artificially accelerated, but human limits, despite chemical manipulation, remained unaltered. In the metrics of health, endurance, and morale, the Wehrmacht's early triumphs were shadowed by a rising, undeniable debt, one that would shape both the campaigns to come and the long-term survival of the army itself. By the winter of 1941, Pervitin had moved far beyond the experimental or selective use within elite units and had become a staple across almost every branch of the German military. What had begun as a tactical advantage in the early campaigns of Poland and France now permeated the entire structure of the Wehrmacht, the Luftwaffe, and support services alike. Its distribution had evolved from occasional supplementation to systematic, almost institutionalized reliance, creating a force that was chemically interconnected and operationally dependent. At the front, infantry units routinely consumed the stimulant to maintain the grueling pace dictated by strategic objectives. Platoons expected doses during forced marches, night maneuvers, and extended periods of combat readiness. Soldiers quickly internalized the chemical schedule, timing their intake to maximize alertness and minimize crashes. Pervitin was no longer simply a tool for temporary endurance. It had become a predictable, if invisible, component of daily military life. Tank crews followed a similar pattern. The panzer divisions, tasked with rapid penetrations through difficult terrain, depended on crews who could remain alert and coordinated through night-long operations. Drivers, gunners, and commanders consumed stimulants before, during, and after combat, enabling continuous operation of armored units in environments that would have exhausted unenhanced men. The drug masked fatigue, sharpened reflexes, and maintained morale during tasks that demanded near-constant attention. but it also created a fragile dependency within each crew. The Luftwaffe, having pioneered chemical use in aviation for prolonged sorties, now extended this practice across all flying units. Fighter squadrons, bomber crews, and reconnaissance teams relied on Pervitin for early morning scrambles, extended patrols, and night operations. The stimulant allowed pilots to endure long hours in the cockpit, react quickly to evolving threats, and maintain the focus required for precision maneuvers. Yet, withdrawal, crashes, and overstimulation increasingly disrupted these same units, particularly when resupply lagged or when multiple missions overlapped in intensity. Even in rear areas and support units, stimulant use proliferated. Supply drivers, clerks, communications personnel, and medical staff relied on Pervitin to manage extended working hours, irregular schedules, and extreme environmental conditions. Long-distance convoys, essential for maintaining supply lines across the vast Eastern Front, were staffed by drivers whose endurance had been artificially extended, often to dangerous extremes. Delays, accidents, and miscalculations became more common as personnel became chemically fatigued, highlighting the systemic nature of dependence beyond the combat front. Commanders at every level recognized the utility of the stimulant but struggled to control its consequences. Reports surfaced of soldiers taking doses in excess, exhibiting erratic behavior, or suffering sudden collapses. Yet, operational imperatives, the expectation of relentless speed, unbroken lines, and constant readiness, outweighed concerns. Stimulants became woven into planning, strategy, and logistical calculations. Schedules were predicated on chemically sustained endurance, and any disruption in supply threatened both operational cohesion and effectiveness. The spread of stimulant use also revealed a broader cultural adaptation. Soldiers shared tablets informally, passed doses to comrades in need, and developed unofficial routines for intake. Units became socially and operationally intertwined through chemical dependence, creating an army that functioned at extraordinary speed, but whose coordination was now contingent on the continued availability of Pervitin. The reliance was invisible to external observers, yet pervasive. Virtually every soldier, at some point in the early campaigns, had ingested the drug to maintain performance. By late 1941, stimulant use had become a defining feature of German military operations. The drug was no longer a supplemental advantage, it was structural. Human limits were extended artificially, and the army had adapted its tactics, logistics, and operational tempo to accommodate chemical endurance. But embedded within this advantage was a growing vulnerability. The army's effectiveness was now inseparable from the stimulant that masked fatigue, suppressed natural caution, and enabled feats of endurance that were physiologically unsustainable. The spread of stimulant use had transformed the Wehrmacht into a force operating at the intersection of chemistry and command, capable of remarkable achievements, yet increasingly fragile beneath the veneer of invincibility. By the winter of 1941, medical personnel both at the front and in rear area hospitals began to recognize that the prolonged, widespread use of Pervitin was leaving a tangible mark on the health of German soldiers. What had initially been hailed as a miracle of modern chemistry, a tablet that could erase fatigue, sharpen reflexes, and sustain operational tempo, was revealing a darker, more insidious side. The stimulant that had allowed rapid advances across Europe now threatened to undermine the very human resources upon which those victories depended. Physical consequences were among the earliest to manifest. Soldiers presented with tremors in the hands, palpitations, dizziness, and a pervasive sense of exhaustion that no amount of stimulant could alleviate. Field medics noted a rise in cardiovascular complaints, irregular heartbeat, chest pains, and shortness of breath during exertion that had previously been manageable. The prolonged overstimulation of the sympathetic nervous system, combined with inadequate rest and exposure to harsh environments, was taxing bodies in ways that were not immediately lethal, but profoundly debilitating over time. Sleep disruption was universal. Men who had relied on Pervitin for extended wakefulness now struggled to achieve restorative rest, even during periods of inactivity. Insomnia persisted long after operations had paused, leaving soldiers physically drained and mentally fragile. This chronic sleep deprivation exacerbated existing health issues, contributing to weakened immunity, increased susceptibility to illness, and slower recovery from injuries that in less chemically dependent troops would have healed more readily. Psychological consequences were equally concerning. Repeated stimulant use had begun to erode emotional stability and cognitive function. Soldiers reported heightened anxiety, persistent irritability, and difficulty concentrating during routine tasks. Field reports documented hallucinations, paranoia, and erratic decision-making even in non-combat scenarios. The neurological impact of prolonged methamphetamine exposure, amplified by battlefield stress, sleep deprivation, and harsh environmental conditions, was becoming undeniable. Addiction and dependency added another layer of complexity. Many soldiers had developed a psychological reliance on Pervitin, feeling incapable of performing without the drug. Withdrawal symptoms appeared when doses were reduced, delayed, or withheld, creating instability across units. Fatigue returned with force, accompanied by anxiety, depression, and sometimes panic attacks. Soldiers, who had previously marched tirelessly, now required extended rest periods and supplemental care, disrupting operational planning and stressing officers attempting to maintain continuity in the field. Medical officers documented these effects systematically, though reports often reached higher command filtered through operational priorities. Casualty statistics rarely differentiated between deaths, injuries, and health issues exacerbated by stimulant overuse. Nevertheless, patterns were clear. Units that relied heavily on Pervitin exhibited higher rates of collapse, psychological breakdown, and long-term physiological strain than those with more limited or carefully monitored exposure. Even support personnel, drivers, medics, and administrative staff were beginning to show similar symptoms, highlighting the systemic nature of the problem. The long-term implications extended beyond immediate campaigns. Veterans returning from the Eastern Front, already showing signs of dependence, faced persistent cardiovascular issues, chronic insomnia, and psychological instability. Field hospitals documented cases of sustained tremors, anxiety disorders, and in extreme instances, psychosis conditions linked directly to extended stimulant use combined with combat stress. Soldiers who had performed at seemingly superhuman levels now bore the hidden costs in bodies and minds that were irrevocably altered. By late 1941, the initial miracle of chemical endurance had become a warning. Pervitin had enabled victories, accelerated campaigns, and reshaped operational tempo. Yet in doing so, it had quietly imposed a debt on the soldiers themselves, a human cost that would outlast battlefields, affect combat readiness, and reverberate throughout the German military for months and years to come. The long-term health consequences were no longer theoretical. They were visible, measurable, and inevitable, a silent reckoning for an army that had learned to outrun exhaustion, only to confront the price of doing so. By the end of 1941, the influence of Pervitin extended far beyond individual soldiers, shaping the very strategies and operational decisions of the Wehrmacht. Commanders had come to expect chemically enhanced performance as a baseline rather than an anomaly, integrating stimulant use into the planning and execution of campaigns. The human body, artificially extended in its endurance, had become both a tool and a constraint, and the Army's doctrine evolved to accommodate it. Operational planning began to assume near-constant wakefulness and sustained alertness. March schedules, offensive timetables, and logistical projections all incorporated the implicit expectation that soldiers would maintain performance through chemical aid. Night operations, extended marches, and rapid breakthroughs were no longer extraordinary, they were standard. Pervitin allowed planners to compress time, moving forces faster than natural human limitations would normally allow. Campaigns were designed not solely around terrain or enemy disposition, but around the predictable effects of stimulant-enhanced endurance. This dependency shaped tactics. Officers relied on the drug to maintain relentless pressure, assuming that infantry and armored units could continue to advance for hours without pause. Reconnaissance units were sent on extended patrols deep behind enemy lines, capable of returning with intelligence during periods previously considered too exhausting or risky. Artillery and supply units were expected to operate at a constant tempo, ensuring ammunition, food, and medical support matched the artificially extended activity of combat troops. The stimulant became an unspoken linchpin in the execution of Blitzkrieg. However, this chemical reliance introduced new vulnerabilities. When supplies of Pervitin were delayed or disrupted, entire operations risked faltering. Soldiers who had depended on stimulant use for hours of wakefulness and focus were suddenly prone to fatigue, error, or collapse. Commanders learned quickly that the army's effectiveness was no longer solely a function of numbers, training, or equipment, but also of chemical access. A stalled convoy, a missed distribution, or a sudden drop in available doses could cascade into delays, miscommunications, and operational setbacks. Dependency also influenced decision-making in subtle ways. High command and field officers became increasingly willing to order extended operations, night assaults, and rapid advances, confident that Pervitin would keep troops functional. Risk thresholds were altered. The chemical edge encouraged aggressive maneuvers that might have been avoided under normal human limits. Commanders trusted in the artificial stamina of their forces, sometimes pushing units beyond safe operational boundaries, unaware of the long-term consequences of over-reliance. At the tactical level, the psychological aspect of dependency shaped morale and obedience. Soldiers internalized the expectation that Pervitin was necessary for performance. Withdrawal or insufficient doses could erode confidence and operational cohesion. Officers observed that units functioned smoothly when stimulant availability was adequate, but tension, irritability, and disorientation arose immediately when it was not. Dependency had become a structural feature of the army, linking chemical administration directly to battlefield performance. By 1942, the pattern was clear. The Wehrmacht's early successes had been shaped as much by Pervitin as by strategy, training, or firepower. The drug had allowed rapid advances, extended campaigns, and unprecedented operational tempo. Yet it had also created a fragile system, one in which human endurance was artificially amplified, operational assumptions were chemically reinforced, and the army's ability to sustain itself was contingent on continued stimulant supply. In effect, dependency had become strategy. Pervitin did not merely enable soldiers to march or fight, it dictated the pace, scope, and ambition of German military operations. The army was no longer solely an instrument of command and doctrine. It was a machine whose rhythm, reach, and effectiveness were inseparably bound to a chemical lifeline, a dependency that would shape decisions, victories, and ultimately, vulnerabilities for the campaigns that lay ahead. By the close of 1941, the Wehrmacht had achieved a string of remarkable victories across Europe and deep into the Soviet Union. Blitzkrieg had appeared unstoppable. Tanks surged across forests and plains. Infantry marched with mechanical precision, and air support coordinated with near-perfect timing. The speed, coordination, and intensity of operations astonished both enemies and observers alike. Yet beneath this seeming mastery lay a stark and unacknowledged truth. The army had achieved its early triumphs not solely through planning, training, or technology, but through an artificial extension of human endurance. Pervitin, the stimulant that had powered soldiers through nights without sleep, forced marches, and relentless combat, had created both an advantage and a hidden liability. Medical reports, anecdotal evidence, and operational observations all pointed to a troubling pattern. Soldiers exhibited tremors, insomnia, hallucinations, and emotional instability. Units became chemically dependent, capable of extraordinary feats only while the drug was available. Withdrawal caused systemic crashes, compromising coordination, morale, and discipline. Officers, aware of these issues, had largely adapted by turning a blind eye, prioritizing operational momentum over human limits. Command structures, logistics, and tactics had evolved to accommodate chemical endurance, embedding stimulant reliance into the very fabric of military operations. Yet the lessons of these experiences remained unlearned at the strategic level. High Command continued to plan campaigns assuming the same artificial levels of alertness, stamina, and aggression could be replicated indefinitely. Reports of psychological breakdowns, physical exhaustion, and stimulant shortages were filtered through operational priorities, often sanitized or minimized. The remarkable pace achieved in Poland, France, and early campaigns in the Soviet Union was treated as proof of German superiority rather than a temporary, chemically sustained phenomenon. The implicit understanding of human vulnerability, though evident to field medics and mid-level commanders, was never fully integrated into long-term strategy. The dangers were compounded by ideological and cultural pressures. Nazi propaganda celebrated invincibility, discipline, and the relentless drive of the German soldier. Acknowledging dependence on stimulants threatened both the image of the army and the narratives that justified expansionist ambitions. Commanders and political leaders alike found it expedient to frame victories as the product of skill, courage, and doctrinal brilliance, rather than a chemically mediated extension of human limits. The very success that had relied on Pervitin reinforced the illusion that human endurance could be indefinitely pushed beyond natural thresholds. Operational decisions reflected this misunderstanding. Campaigns were planned for rapid movement, continuous engagement, and night operations, all scenarios that assumed the continued availability of chemical support. Logistics were stressed to match the artificially accelerated pace. Troop rotations, rest schedules, and medical care were often inadequate for units whose stamina had been artificially enhanced. The army had learned how to exploit chemical endurance, but it had not internalized the limitations or the human cost. By the end of 1941, the Wehrmacht faced a sobering reality. The advantages of stimulants were finite, their effects temporary, and their consequences cumulative. Soldiers carried not only physical fatigue, but psychological strain, dependency, and vulnerabilities that could compromise future operations. High Command, having failed to fully integrate these realities into planning, risked overextension and the slow unraveling of an army whose apparent invincibility rested on chemical enhancement. The lesson remained unlearned. Pervitin had propelled the Wehrmacht to early victories, but it had also sown the seeds of systemic fragility. Speed, aggression, and endurance came at a hidden price, one that Germany would continue to pay as the war expanded, fronts grew longer, and human limits collided with the demands of a war machine artificially accelerated beyond its natural capacity. The early victories were undeniable. The costs, largely invisible at the time, were only beginning to be understood, and in ignoring them, the army had set a precedent for reliance on chemical enhancement that would have profound consequences in the campaigns yet to come.